In the windswept highlands of ancient Anatolia, during the 8th millennium before the Common Era, humanity stood at a crossroads that would determine the fate of the species for millennia to come. The shamans of this primordial age possessed abilities that modern imperial scholars would recognize as psychic powers, though crude and unfocused compared to the refined techniques later developed. These ancient mystics served as humanity's first line of defense against the predatory entities that lurked in the roiling depths of the Imperium, that parallel dimension of psychic energy and emotion that would later be known as the Warp. The shamans had long understood that death was not the end for those blessed with psychic sensitivity. Upon physical death, their souls would journey into the Warp, where they could continue to exist as discorporate entities. For countless generations, this cycle had continued unbroken, with the shamans reincarnating into new bodies while retaining fragments of their accumulated wisdom and power. This process allowed humanity's psychic guardians to grow stronger with each passing generation, building an ever more effective bulwark against the malevolent forces that sought to prey upon human souls. However, as humanity's numbers grew and their emotions intensified, the Warp itself began to change. What had once been a relatively calm psychic realm gradually became more turbulent and dangerous. Predatory entities, drawn by the increasing psychic emanations of human consciousness, began to hunt the shaman's souls during their journey through the Imperium. These creatures, primitive precursors to the demons that would later plague mankind, devoured the shaman's essence before they could complete their reincarnation cycle. The shamans recognized this growing threat with mounting horror. Their numbers were dwindling with each passing generation, and they foresaw a time when humanity would be left defenseless against the predators of the Warp. Without their protection, the human species would become easy prey for entities that fed on psychic energy and emotion. The shamans understood that desperate measures were required to preserve their guardianship of humanity. After extensive deliberation and consultation with the most powerful among their number, the shamans devised a plan of unprecedented scope and sacrifice. Rather than face extinction piecemeal, they would pool their collective souls into a single, impossibly powerful entity. This being would possess the accumulated wisdom, knowledge, and psychic might of thousands of shamans, creating an immortal guardian capable of protecting humanity throughout the ages. The ritual they conceived required the simultaneous death of every remaining shaman on Earth. In a coordinated act of self-sacrifice that spanned continents, these ancient protectors consumed lethal poisons, their bodies failing in perfect synchronization. As their souls departed their physical forms, they did not scatter into the Warp as individual entities. Instead, guided by their collective will and the power of their ritual, the shaman's souls merged into a single, blazing point of psychic energy within the Imperium. This fusion created something entirely new in the galaxy's history. The combined essence of the shamans formed a soul of such incredible power and complexity that it could not be destroyed by the predatory entities of the Warp. Instead, this merged consciousness became a beacon of human potential, a psychic entity of godlike proportions that possessed the accumulated memories and abilities of every shaman who had contributed to its creation. The newborn soul did not remain long in the Warp. Drawn by the natural cycle of reincarnation that the shamans had long utilized, this impossibly powerful consciousness sought out a suitable vessel for its return to the material realm. In a small settlement in the Anatolian highlands, a child was born who would serve as the physical anchor for this transcendent being. The infant appeared unremarkable to those who witnessed his birth, but within his developing mind resided the combined wisdom of humanity's first psychic guardians. This child was the emperor of mankind, though he would not claim that title for many thousands of years. From his earliest moments, he possessed capabilities that far exceeded those of any normal human. His psychic abilities manifested almost immediately, allowing him to perceive the Warp with crystalline clarity and manipulate psychic energy with instinctive precision. More importantly, he retained the accumulated memories and knowledge of the shamans who had sacrificed themselves to create him, giving him an understanding of humanity's past and potential that no other being could match. As the emperor grew to physical maturity, he began to comprehend the true scope of his existence and purpose. He was not merely a powerful psyker or an exceptionally gifted individual. He was the living embodiment of humanity's collective psychic potential, a being created specifically to guide and protect the species through the trials that lay ahead. This understanding shaped every decision he would make throughout his impossibly long existence. The early centuries of the Emperor's life were spent in careful observation and learning. He traveled extensively throughout the ancient world, studying the various civilizations that had emerged from humanity's primitive origins. He witnessed the rise of the first great cities, observed the development of agriculture and metallurgy, and watched as humans began to organize themselves into increasingly complex societies. Throughout these wanderings, he remained hidden, presenting himself as nothing more than a wise traveler or learned scholar. During this period, the Emperor began to develop his understanding of the warp and the entities that dwelt within it. The shamanic knowledge he had inherited provided him with a foundation, but he quickly surpassed their primitive techniques through direct experimentation and study. He learned to navigate the currents of the Imperium with unprecedented skill, mapping its ever-shifting geography and cataloging the various creatures that inhabited its depths. More troubling was his growing awareness of the fundamental changes occurring within the warp itself. The psychic realm was becoming increasingly violent and chaotic, shaped by the emotions and conflicts of humanity's expanding populations. The Emperor recognized that the predatory entities the shamans had feared were merely the harbingers of far greater threats. Deep within the warp, fed by millennia of human emotion and conflict, new powers were stirring, entities that would eventually become known as the Chaos Gods. As human civilization advanced, the Emperor began to take a more active role in guiding its development. He could not reveal his true nature or openly rule, as doing so would expose humanity to the very dangers he sought to protect them from. Instead, he adopted a series of carefully crafted identities, each designed to influence human progress from positions of authority and respect. In ancient Mesopotamia, he appeared as a wise king who established just laws and promoted learning. His reign brought unprecedented prosperity to the region, and the legal codes he established influenced jurisprudence for millennia to come. When that identity had served its purpose, he arranged for his apparent death and moved on to another role in a different land. Throughout the classical period, the Emperor manifested as various influential figures across multiple civilizations. He served as a philosopher in ancient Greece, contributing to the development of rational thought and scientific inquiry. His teachings, carefully disguised as the work of mortal scholars, helped lay the groundwork for humanity's eventual mastery of technology and reason. In other regions, he appeared as a military commander, leading armies against threats that posed existential dangers to human civilization. The Emperor's approach to religious matters required particular delicacy. He understood that humanity's spiritual needs were real and important, but he also recognized the dangers posed by organized religion. Religious fervor could strengthen the chaos gods by feeding them concentrated emotional energy, while religious conflicts created the kind of suffering and hatred that nourished demonic entities. When he did assume religious roles, he carefully crafted teachings that promoted human unity and progress, while avoiding the extremes that could empower the warp's malevolent inhabitants. During the rise of the Roman Empire, the Emperor took particular interest in the development of large-scale governmental systems. He observed how the Romans organized their vast territories and managed diverse populations, learning valuable lessons about administration and control that he would later apply on a galactic scale. He may have influenced certain Roman leaders, though always from the shadows, never revealing his true nature. The Emperor's psychic abilities continued to develop throughout these millennia of hidden existence. What had begun as the combined power of the ancient shamans evolved into something far more sophisticated and potent. He learned to manipulate not just psychic energy, but the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. His mastery of biomancy allowed him to maintain his physical form in apparent youth for centuries at a time, while his telepathic abilities grew so refined that he could read the thoughts of entire populations without their awareness. Perhaps most importantly, the Emperor developed an unprecedented understanding of the relationship between the material universe and the warp. He learned to perceive the threads of causality that connected events across space and time, allowing him to predict the consequences of actions with remarkable accuracy. This foresight became one of his most valuable tools, enabling him to guide human development along paths that would strengthen the species while minimizing their exposure to chaos. The Emperor also began to experiment with genetic manipulation during this period, though on a far smaller scale than his later works. He studied the biological foundations of psychic ability, learning to identify and enhance the genetic markers that determined an individual's potential for warp manipulation. These early experiments provided crucial knowledge that would eventually enable him to create the Primarchs and the Space Marine Legions. As the centuries passed, the Emperor's understanding of his ultimate purpose became increasingly clear. Humanity was approaching a critical juncture in its development. The species' psychic potential was growing stronger with each generation, but this same growth was making them increasingly vulnerable to predation by chaos entities. The Emperor foresaw a time when humanity would need to transcend its current limitations and evolve into something greater, a psychic species capable of defending itself against the horrors of the warp. This vision of humanity's future shaped every aspect of the Emperor's long-term planning. He began to identify and preserve crucial technologies and knowledge that would be needed for humanity's eventual ascension. He established hidden repositories of information in locations across Terra, ensuring that vital secrets would survive even if human civilization collapsed. He also began to identify individuals with exceptional psychic potential, sometimes guiding their bloodlines across generations to preserve and strengthen their gifts. The Emperor's activities during the medieval period demonstrate his growing urgency about humanity's future. As the warp became increasingly turbulent and the first stirrings of the Age of Strife began to manifest, he took greater risks in his efforts to prepare humanity for the trials ahead. He appeared more frequently as influential figures, though always maintaining the careful balance between guidance and concealment that had served him for millennia. The careful balance the Emperor had maintained for millennia began to crumble during the 15th millennium. What started as isolated incidents of psychic disturbance gradually escalated into a catastrophe that would fundamentally reshape human civilization. The Age of Strife, as it would later be known, represented humanity's darkest hour since its emergence from the primordial caves of ancient Terra. The initial signs were subtle but ominous. Navigators, those rare humans whose mutations allowed them to perceive the warp and guide spacecraft through its currents, began reporting increasingly violent storms within the Imperium. What had once been predictable routes between star systems became treacherous passages filled with hostile entities and reality-warping phenomena. Ships that entered the warp during routine journeys simply vanished, their crews and cargo lost to the ravenous appetites of demonic predators. As the warp storms intensified, the vast network of interstellar communication and trade that bound human civilization together began to fragment. Worlds that had maintained contact for thousands of years found themselves suddenly isolated, cut off from the greater community of mankind by impassable barriers of psychic turbulence. The navigators' houses, those ancient institutions that had guided humanity's expansion among the stars, watched helplessly as their members fell victim to possession, madness, or worse fates when they attempted to pierce the growing veil of chaos. The Emperor observed these developments with growing alarm. His enhanced perception allowed him to see what others could not. The fundamental structure of the warp was changing, becoming more hostile to human consciousness with each passing year. The Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities born from humanity's collective emotions, were growing stronger and more active. Their influence was beginning to seep into the material universe through the expanding network of warp storms, bringing corruption and madness to worlds that had never before experienced such horrors. On Terra itself, the effects of the Age of Strife manifested in ways that would have seemed impossible during humanity's golden age of expansion. The planet's population, once unified under a single planetary government, began to fragment into competing factions as communication with the wider galaxy failed. Without the resources and trade networks that had sustained Terra's advanced civilization, technology began to regress. Ancient knowledge was lost as the institutions that preserved it collapsed or turned their attention to mere survival. The breakdown of central authority on Terra created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by ambitious warlords and demagogues. These figures, styling themselves as kings, emperors, and gods, carved out territories from the ruins of the old world order. They employed whatever technologies they could salvage or maintain, creating bizarre hybrid armies that combined advanced energy weapons with primitive melee combat. The techno-barbarian warlords, as they became known, transformed Terra's once magnificent cities into fortress states locked in perpetual warfare. The Emperor watched from the shadows as the world he had helped guide for millennia descended into barbarism. His hidden repositories of knowledge and technology remained secure, protected by psychic wards and concealment devices that rendered them invisible to the warring factions. But the human cost of the collapse weighed heavily upon him. Billions died in the endless conflicts that raged across Terra's surface, while countless more suffered under the brutal rule of petty tyrants who cared nothing for the greater destiny of mankind. Perhaps most troubling were the mutations that began to appear among Terra's population. The increasing warp activity caused genetic instabilities that manifested in horrific physical deformities and mental aberrations. Entire bloodlines were corrupted, producing offspring that bore little resemblance to baseline humanity. These mutant populations, shunned and persecuted by their unaltered neighbors, formed their own tribes and communities in Terra's most desolate regions. Some retained enough intelligence to organize themselves into coherent societies, while others devolved into savage bands that preyed upon anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The psychic awakening that had been gradually building throughout human history accelerated dramatically during the Age of Strife. Individuals with latent psychic abilities found their powers manifesting spontaneously, often with catastrophic results. Untrained psychers became conduits for demonic possession, transforming peaceful communities into scenes of supernatural horror. The phenomenon was so widespread that many human settlements instituted brutal purges of anyone suspected of possessing psychic abilities, leading to the persecution and death of countless innocents. The Emperor recognized that humanity stood at the brink of extinction. The species that had once spread across the galaxy was now trapped on isolated worlds, cut off from each other and vulnerable to the predations of chaos. On Terra, the situation was particularly dire. The techno-barbarian warlords showed no sign of unifying their fractured domains, while the mutant tribes grew stronger and more aggressive with each passing generation. If current trends continued, baseline humanity would either be wiped out entirely or so corrupted by chaos that it would become indistinguishable from the very enemies it sought to resist. After millennia of careful manipulation from the shadows, the Emperor made the momentous decision to reveal himself openly. The time for subtlety had passed. Humanity's survival now required direct intervention on a scale that would fundamentally alter the course of history. He began to make preparations for his emergence, drawing upon the vast resources and knowledge he had accumulated over the centuries. The Emperor's first step was to establish a secure base of operations from which to launch his campaign of unification. He selected a location in the Himalayan mountains, where the ancient peaks provided natural defenses and the thin atmosphere would deter casual intruders. Using advanced construction techniques that combined recovered Dark Age technology with his own innovations, he built a vast underground complex that would serve as both fortress and laboratory. This hidden facility became the birthplace of the Emperor's most ambitious project, the creation of an army capable of conquering Terra and reuniting humanity under a single banner. The Emperor understood that conventional forces would be insufficient for this task. The techno-barbarian warlords commanded armies equipped with advanced weapons and armor, while the mutant tribes possessed physical capabilities that far exceeded those of baseline humans. To defeat such enemies, he would need warriors who combined the best aspects of both. The Thunder Warriors represented the Emperor's first attempt at creating superhuman soldiers. Drawing upon his millennia of genetic research and his deep understanding of human biology, he began to design warriors who would surpass ordinary humans in every measurable category. The process was extraordinarily complex, requiring precise manipulation of genetic sequences and careful integration of artificial enhancements with natural biological systems. The Emperor's laboratories hummed with activity as he refined his techniques through countless experiments and iterations. Each Thunder Warrior was a unique creation, their genetic template carefully tailored to maximize their combat effectiveness while maintaining psychological stability. The augmentation process itself was brutal and dangerous, with many subjects dying during the transformation. Those who survived emerged as living weapons of unprecedented capability, standing nearly 3 meters tall and possessing strength that allowed them to crush steel with their bare hands. The Thunder Warriors were physically imposing, even by the standards of the Age of Strife. Their enhanced musculature and reinforced skeletal structure made them capable of surviving injuries that would kill ordinary humans, while their improved nervous systems granted them reflexes fast enough to dodge incoming projectiles. Most importantly, their minds remained fundamentally human, allowing them to think tactically and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The Emperor equipped his Thunder Warriors with weapons and armor that matched their enhanced capabilities. The massive bolters they carried fired explosive shells, capable of punching through vehicle armor, while their power armor provided protection against all but the most devastating attacks. Each warrior was also trained in the use of melee weapons, as the Emperor recognized that close combat would play a crucial role in the battles to come. The Unification Wars began with a series of carefully planned strikes against isolated techno-barbarian strongholds. The Emperor personally led these initial assaults, his psychic abilities allowing him to coordinate his forces with supernatural precision. The sight of the golden armored figure striding through the battlefield, wielding powers that seemed to bend reality itself, had a profound psychological impact on both his enemies and his own warriors. The first major engagement occurred against the Pan-Pacific Empire, a techno-barbarian state that controlled much of the former Pacific Rim. The Empire's forces were well-equipped and disciplined, possessing advanced aircraft and armored vehicles that had been maintained since the dark age of technology. Their commanders were experienced veterans who had spent decades fighting similar conflicts, and they initially dismissed the Emperor's forces as just another upstart warlord's army. The Thunder Warriors shattered these preconceptions within hours of the battle's commencement. Moving with coordinated precision, they advanced through the Empire's defensive positions like an unstoppable tide of destruction. Their bolters tore through enemy infantry formations, while their enhanced strength allowed them to literally tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands. The Empire's air support proved ineffective against warriors who could leap dozens of meters into the air and drag aircraft from the sky. The psychological impact of witnessing superhuman warriors in action proved as devastating as their physical capabilities. Empire soldiers who had faced death countless times found themselves paralyzed by terror as the Thunder Warriors carved through their ranks. Stories of the Golden Giant who led these impossible warriors spread throughout the Empire's territories, undermining morale and encouraging defections even before the Emperor's forces arrived. The conquest of the Pan-Pacific Empire established the pattern that would define the Unification Wars. The Emperor's forces would strike with overwhelming force and precision, targeting key strategic points while demonstrating their superhuman capabilities. Enemy commanders who surrendered were often incorporated into the growing imperial hierarchy, while those who resisted were eliminated without mercy. The Emperor showed no tolerance for those who would perpetuate Terra's division, understanding that any weakness or hesitation would only prolong the suffering of humanity. As news of the Emperor's victory spread, other techno-barbarian warlords began to take notice. Some attempted to form alliances against this new threat, while others sought to negotiate terms for their surrender. The Emperor evaluated each situation individually, sometimes accepting peaceful submission when it served his purposes and other times making examples of those who opposed him to discourage further resistance. The mutant tribes presented a different kind of challenge. Unlike the techno-barbarians, who fought with recognizable tactics and equipment, the mutant populations had adapted to Terra's harsh environment in ways that made them unpredictable and dangerous. Some tribes had developed natural armor plating that could deflect small arms fire, while others possessed venomous claws or the ability to see in complete darkness. Their knowledge of Terra's hidden passages and underground networks made them formidable guerrilla fighters. The Emperor's approach to the mutant threat was characteristically thorough and ruthless. He recognized that many of the mutations were caused by chaos corruption, making the affected populations inherently dangerous to baseline humanity. However, he also understood that not all mutations were malevolent, and some mutant populations retained enough humanity to be potentially salvageable. The Emperor's vision extended far beyond the mere reunification of Terra. As the unification wars drew to their inevitable conclusion, and the last techno-barbarian strongholds fell before the Thunder Warriors' relentless advance, his gaze turned skyward to the scattered remnants of humanity spread across the galaxy. The Age of Strife had isolated countless human worlds, leaving them vulnerable to alien predation, chaos corruption, and the slow decay of technological regression. The Emperor understood that humanity's survival depended not merely on planetary unity, but on the establishment of a galaxy-spanning empire that could protect the species from the myriad threats that surrounded it. This grand vision crystallized into what would become known as the Imperial Truth, a secular philosophy that would serve as the ideological foundation for humanity's expansion among the stars. The Emperor had witnessed firsthand how religious fervor and superstition had empowered the Chaos Gods throughout human history, feeding them the emotional energy they required to grow stronger and more influential. His Imperial Truth explicitly rejected all forms of supernatural belief, instead promoting reason, science, and human achievement as the guiding principles of civilization. According to the Imperial Truth, humanity was destined to inherit the galaxy through its own efforts and abilities. There were no gods to worship, no supernatural forces to appease, and no mystical powers beyond the understanding of rational inquiry. Even the Emperor's own obvious psychic abilities were explained in scientific terms as the result of advanced human evolution rather than divine intervention. This careful reframing was essential to his long-term strategy, as widespread belief in his divinity would only strengthen the very chaos entities he sought to starve of worshipful energy. The secular empire the Emperor envisioned would be built upon the twin pillars of technological advancement and military might. Human colonies would be connected by reliable warp travel, protected by fleets of warships, and governed by rational administrators who understood their role as servants of humanity's greater destiny. Alien species that posed threats to human expansion would be eliminated without mercy, while those that could be safely ignored would be left to their own devices in regions of space that held no strategic value. To achieve this monumental undertaking, the Emperor recognized that he would need warriors far superior to even the Thunder Warriors who had served him so well during the Unification Wars. The Thunder Warriors, despite their impressive capabilities, suffered from significant limitations that made them unsuitable for a galaxy-spanning campaign. Their genetic modifications were inherently unstable, leading to cellular breakdown and psychological deterioration over time. Many Thunder Warriors who had survived the early battles of unification were already showing signs of mental instability and physical degradation that would only worsen with age. More fundamentally, the Thunder Warriors had been designed as shock troops for planetary conquest rather than as the foundation of a permanent military organization. They lacked the genetic diversity and adaptability that would be required for the varied challenges of galactic warfare. Fighting alien species with exotic biologies and unknown capabilities would demand warriors who could adapt to any situation while maintaining their effectiveness across decades or even centuries of continuous campaigning. The solution to these limitations lay in the Emperor's most ambitious genetic engineering project to date, the creation of the Primarchs. These beings would serve as the genetic templates for new legions of superhuman warriors, each one designed to excel in specific aspects of warfare while maintaining the stability and longevity that the Thunder Warriors lacked. The Primarchs would be the Emperor's sons in both a literal and symbolic sense, carrying within their genetic structure the accumulated knowledge and capabilities that he had developed over millennia of existence. The Emperor established his primary laboratory deep within the Himalaysian fortress complex, in chambers that were shielded from both physical intrusion and psychic observation. The work that took place within these sealed halls represented the pinnacle of genetic science, combining techniques that had been lost since the dark age of technology with innovations that pushed the boundaries of biological possibility. Each Primarch would be a unique creation, their genetic template carefully crafted to produce specific traits and abilities that would complement their intended role in the coming crusade. The process of creating the Primarchs required more than mere genetic manipulation. The Emperor drew upon his vast psychic abilities to imbue each developing embryo with a fragment of his own essence, creating beings that were not merely superhuman in physical terms, but possessed cognitive abilities and intuitive understanding that approached his own. This psychic imprinting would allow the Primarchs to comprehend complex strategic situations instinctively and lead their forces with a level of tactical brilliance that no ordinary human could match. 20 distinct genetic templates were developed, each one representing a different aspect of the perfect warrior leader. Some were designed for close combat excellence, their enhanced musculature and reflexes making them unmatched in personal combat. Others were optimized for strategic thinking and battlefield coordination, their enhanced neural structures allowing them to process vast amounts of tactical information simultaneously. Still others were crafted for specific environments or combat roles, from siege warfare specialists to masters of rapid assault operations. The gestation chambers that housed the developing Primarchs were marvels of biotechnology, maintaining perfect environmental conditions while monitoring every aspect of their subjects' development. The Emperor personally oversaw each stage of the process, making minute adjustments to genetic sequences and psychic imprinting patterns as the Primarchs grew from embryonic cells into fully formed beings. The project consumed years of intensive work, during which the Emperor rarely left his laboratories except to address the most critical matters of planetary governance. As the Primarchs neared completion, the Emperor began preparing for their awakening and the next phase of his grand design. He established training facilities where his new sons would learn to harness their abilities and understand their roles in the coming crusade. Educational programs were developed that would provide them with comprehensive knowledge of human history, military strategy, and the scientific principles that govern the universe. Each Primarch would emerge from their gestation chamber as a fully formed adult with the knowledge and capabilities needed to lead armies across the galaxy. The tragedy that befell the Primarch project struck without warning during the final stages of their development. The Emperor's psychic senses detected a massive disturbance in the warp surrounding Terra, far more powerful than the random storms that had plagued interstellar travel during the Age of Strife. This was a focused assault by the Chaos Gods themselves, who had finally recognized the threat that the Emperor's project posed to their long-term plans for humanity. The four great powers of chaos combined their efforts in an unprecedented display of cooperation, tearing open rifts in reality that bypassed every defensive ward and psychic barrier the Emperor had erected around his laboratories. Demonic entities poured through these breaches, but their target was not destruction or corruption in the conventional sense. Instead, they sought to steal the Emperor's greatest creations before they could be awakened and deployed against the forces of chaos. The Emperor fought desperately to protect his work, wielding psychic powers that lit up the warp like a miniature star. His battle against the chaos entities raged across multiple dimensions simultaneously as he struggled to prevent them from reaching the gestation chambers. Despite his tremendous abilities, the combined might of all four chaos gods proved overwhelming. The demon succeeded in breaching the innermost sanctum of his laboratory and seizing the 20 gestation pods that contained the nearly completed Primarchs. The pods were hurled through the warp with such violence that they scattered across the entire galaxy, each one following a different trajectory through the chaotic currents of the Imperium. The Emperor's psychic connection to his creations allowed him to sense their dispersal, but the interference generated by the chaos assault made it impossible to track their specific destinations. His sons, who should have awakened in the safety of Terra under his direct guidance, would instead emerge on alien worlds far from their father's protection. The loss of the Primarchs represented a devastating setback to the Emperor's plans, but he refused to allow despair to cloud his judgment. The genetic templates used to create his sons remained intact, and the knowledge gained from their development could still be applied to create the armies he needed for galactic conquest. If he could not have his sons to lead the crusade from its beginning, he would create their legions and trust that fate would eventually reunite him with his scattered offspring. The Space Marine legions emerged from this necessity, representing a compromise between the Emperor's ideal vision and the harsh realities imposed by chaos interference. Using genetic material derived from his own enhanced biology and incorporating elements from each of the 20 Primarch templates, the Emperor created a new breed of superhuman warrior that combined the best aspects of both sources. These Space Marines would be larger and stronger than ordinary humans, possessed of enhanced reflexes and cognitive abilities that made them ideal soldiers for the challenges of galactic warfare. The process of creating Space Marines was necessarily more complex than the Thunder Warrior augmentation procedures. Rather than simply enhancing adult volunteers, the Space Marine transformation required subjects to be selected during their youth and subjected to a lengthy series of surgical procedures and genetic modifications. 19 additional organs were implanted into each candidate, each one serving a specific function that enhanced their combat effectiveness or survival capabilities. The recruitment process for the first Space Marine legions drew upon the population of Terra itself, selecting candidates from among the most promising young warriors who had distinguished themselves during the final phases of the Unification Wars. These recruits came from diverse backgrounds, including former techno-barbarian soldiers, members of the Imperial Army, and even some individuals from the mutant tribes who had proven their loyalty and genetic stability. The Emperor personally oversaw the selection process, using his psychic abilities to identify candidates who possessed the mental fortitude and genetic compatibility required for successful transformation. The training regimens developed for the Space Marines combined physical conditioning with intensive education in military tactics, xenobiology, and imperial philosophy. Each recruit was expected to master not only the use of their enhanced physical capabilities, but also the complex equipment and weapon systems they would employ during the crusade. The curriculum included detailed studies of known alien species, analysis of combat footage from the Unification Wars, and theoretical exercises in planetary conquest and fleet operations. The first generation of Space Marines emerged from their training as living weapons of unprecedented capability. Standing over 2 meters tall in their powered armor and possessing strength that allowed them to wield weapons that would require crews served mounting for ordinary humans, they represented the pinnacle of human military evolution. Their enhanced physiology allowed them to survive in environments that would be instantly lethal to baseline humans, while their improved cognitive abilities made them capable of processing tactical information and making split-second decisions under the most extreme combat conditions. The organization of the Space Marine legions reflected the Emperor's understanding of military efficiency and chain of command. Each legion was designed to operate as a self-contained military force capable of independent operations across multiple star systems. The command structure incorporated elements from the most successful military organizations in human history, while allowing for the flexibility needed to adapt to the unique challenges of interstellar warfare. As the 30th millennium dawned, the Emperor's preparations for galactic conquest neared completion. The Space Marine legions had been organized and equipped, the Imperial Army had been expanded and modernized, and the first generation of Imperial warships had been constructed in the orbital shipyards above Terra. The time had come to begin the Great Crusade that would reunite humanity and establish the secular empire that the Emperor had envisioned. The initial phase of the Great Crusade focused on securing the Sol system itself, ensuring that Terra would serve as an unassailable base of operations for the expansion that would follow. Several worlds within humanity's birth system had been colonized during the Dark Age of technology, but had been cut off from Terra during the Age of Strife. These isolated colonies had developed along different paths, some maintaining advanced technology, while others had regressed to more primitive states. Mars presented the most significant challenge within the Sol system. The Red Planet had become the domain of the Mechanicum, a techno-religious organization that worshipped technology as the physical manifestation of their machine god. The Mechanicum had preserved much of the scientific knowledge that had been lost elsewhere during the Age of Strife, but their religious beliefs placed them in potential conflict with the secular imperial truth that the Emperor sought to propagate. The Emperor recognized that the Mechanicum's technological expertise would be essential for the success of the Great Crusade. The Forges of Mars produced weapons, vehicles, and starships that were far superior to anything that could be manufactured on Terra, while the Mechanicum's understanding of ancient technologies made them invaluable partners in the recovery and deployment of Dark Age artifacts. Rather than attempt to conquer Mars through military force, the Emperor chose to negotiate a treaty that would preserve the Mechanicum's autonomy while securing their cooperation in his grand enterprise. The Treaty of Mars established the foundation for a partnership that would endure throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The Mechanicum would provide technological support and manufacturing capacity for the Imperial war machine, while the Emperor would respect their religious beliefs and allow them to maintain control over their forge worlds. This compromise required the Emperor to make concessions to his secular ideology, but he understood that pragmatic considerations sometimes outweighed ideological purity. The Emperor's psychic abilities transcended the conventional understanding of what was possible within the material universe. Where ordinary psychers might manipulate localized phenomena or peer briefly into the future, the Emperor wielded powers that operated on planetary and even stellar scales. His consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, allowing him to perceive and influence events in both real space and the warp with equal facility. This dual existence represented something entirely unprecedented in galactic history, a being who could function as effectively in the psychic realm as in the physical universe. His precognitive abilities operated on temporal scales that dwarfed those of even the most gifted human seers. While navigator houses might glimpse fragments of possible futures spanning days or weeks, the Emperor could perceive potential timelines stretching across millennia. These visions were not simple prophecies, but complex probability matrices that accounted for countless variables and decision points. He could observe how individual choices might cascade through history, creating ripple effects that would influence the fate of entire civilizations thousands of years in the future. The Emperor's foresight revealed itself most clearly in his strategic planning for the Great Crusade. Each decision regarding legion deployment, compliance campaigns, and resource allocation was informed by his perception of how these actions would affect humanity's long-term survival. He could see which worlds would prove crucial to the Imperium's stability, which alien species posed genuine threats to human expansion, and which technologies would be essential for defending against future dangers. This temporal awareness allowed him to make preparations for threats that would not manifest for centuries, establishing contingencies and failsafes that his contemporaries could not understand or appreciate. The scope of his telepathic powers extended far beyond individual mind reading into the realm of mass consciousness manipulation. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor could simultaneously maintain psychic contact with hundreds of his commanders across multiple star systems, coordinating their actions with precision that would have been impossible through conventional communication methods. His mental voice could reach across the galaxy instantaneously, bypassing the delays and distortions that plagued astropathic communication networks. More remarkably, the Emperor could influence the collective psyche of entire populations. When his forces arrived at non-compliant worlds, his psychic presence often manifested as an overwhelming sense of authority and inevitability that broke enemy resistance before the first shots were fired. Entire armies would lay down their weapons upon sensing his approach, not through coercion or fear, but through an instinctive recognition of his rightful dominance over human affairs. This ability proved particularly effective against human populations that had regressed to primitive states during the Age of Strife, as their ancestral memories retained echoes of humanity's original psychic guardians. The Emperor's mastery over reality manipulation reached levels that bordered on the divine, though he consistently rejected such characterizations in favor of scientific explanations. He could restructure matter at the molecular level, transforming base elements into complex compounds through direct psychic intervention. During the construction of the Imperial Palace, observers witnessed him literally willing entire sections of architecture into existence, their atomic structures materializing from ambient energy according to his mental blueprints. These feats were not mere displays of power, but practical applications of his understanding of the fundamental forces that governed physical reality. His ability to manipulate gravitational fields allowed him to create localized zones of altered physics that could serve both offensive and defensive purposes. Enemy projectiles would curve away from their intended targets, while his own forces could move with supernatural speed and agility across battlefields where normal movement should have been impossible. The Emperor could generate gravitational lenses that focused stellar radiation into devastating energy beams, or create null gravity zones that trapped enemy aircraft and rendered their weapons ineffective. The Emperor's biological mastery represented perhaps his most sophisticated application of psychic power. His understanding of genetic structures and cellular processes operated at levels that transcended conventional biochemistry, allowing him to perceive and manipulate the fundamental patterns that determined biological form and function. This knowledge enabled him to heal grievous injuries through direct intervention in cellular regeneration processes, accelerating natural healing to the point where mortal wounds could be repaired within minutes. His genetic engineering capabilities emerged from this biological mastery, combining psychic manipulation with advanced scientific techniques to create entirely new forms of life. The process of creating the Primarchs required not only precise genetic modification, but also the infusion of psychic essence that would grant them capabilities beyond what mere genetics could provide. Each Primarch received a fragment of the Emperor's own consciousness, creating beings who possessed intuitive understanding of warfare, leadership, and human nature that could not be learned through conventional education. The creation of the Space Marine gene seed represented another application of this biological mastery. The Emperor designed 19 additional organs that would integrate seamlessly with human physiology, each one serving multiple functions while maintaining compatibility with the recipient's existing biological systems. The complexity of these modifications required constant psychic monitoring and adjustment during the implantation process, as the Emperor had to ensure that each organ would develop properly and function in harmony with the others. His understanding extended to the genetic level of compatibility between different human populations. The Emperor could identify which genetic lineages would produce the most suitable candidates for Space Marine transformation, often detecting hereditary traits that would not manifest for several generations. This foresight allowed him to establish recruitment protocols that would ensure a steady supply of compatible candidates throughout the Great Crusade, even as the legions expanded to encompass hundreds of thousands of warriors. The Emperor's mastery of warp technology surpassed even that of the ancient navigator houses and the most learned Mechanicum tech priests. His understanding of the Immaterium's fundamental nature allowed him to navigate its currents with unprecedented precision, creating stable corridors through regions of space that other travelers would consider impassable. During the Great Crusade, his presence aboard the flagship often reduced journey times by significant margins, as his psychic abilities could smooth the turbulent energies that normally made warp travel unpredictable and dangerous. His manipulation of warp energies extended to the creation of psychic constructs that could exist independently within the Immaterium. These entities, fashioned from pure psychic force and shaped by his will, served as scouts and messengers that could traverse the warp without the limitations that constrained physical vessels. They could gather intelligence from distant regions of the galaxy and return with information that would have taken months to acquire through conventional means. The Emperor's ability to create and maintain psychic barriers represented one of his most crucial defensive capabilities. The wards he established around Terra during the Unification Wars were so sophisticated that they remained effective for millennia, protecting the throne world from demonic incursion even after his internment upon the Golden Throne. These barriers operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of protection that could deflect both physical and psychic attacks. His understanding of demon summoning and banishment exceeded that of any other human practitioner, though he employed these techniques exclusively for defensive purposes. The Emperor could perceive the true names and binding patterns of demonic entities, allowing him to compel their retreat or destroy them entirely through focused psychic assault. His presence on a battlefield often caused lesser demons to flee without engaging, as they instinctively recognized a force capable of their complete annihilation. The Emperor's immortality operated through mechanisms that transcended normal biological processes. His consciousness existed as a stable pattern within the warp itself, anchored to his physical form but not dependent upon it for survival. This dual existence allowed him to regenerate from injuries that would prove fatal to any other being, as his psychic essence could reconstruct damaged tissue according to its original template. Even complete physical destruction would not necessarily prove fatal, as his consciousness could theoretically reconstruct a new body given sufficient time and energy. His regenerative abilities manifested most dramatically during combat situations where he sustained severe injuries. Observers during the Great Crusade reported witnessing the Emperor recover from wounds that had severed limbs or penetrated vital organs, his flesh knitting itself back together within moments of being damaged. These healings were not merely cosmetic, but restored full functionality to damaged systems, suggesting that his regeneration operated at the cellular level rather than simply closing surface wounds. The Emperor's capacity to exist simultaneously in both real space and the warp created unique strategic advantages that he exploited throughout his campaigns. He could maintain his physical presence on a battlefield while simultaneously projecting his consciousness across vast distances to coordinate other operations. This multidimensional awareness allowed him to respond to threats and opportunities across multiple theaters of war simultaneously, effectively multiplying his strategic presence beyond what should have been physically possible. His warp-based existence also granted him access to information networks that operated outside normal space-time constraints. He could perceive events occurring in distant regions of the galaxy through psychic resonance, often becoming aware of significant developments before conventional communication methods could relay the information. This temporal advantage proved crucial during the later stages of the Great Crusade, when the sheer scale of Imperial operations made traditional command and control systems increasingly inadequate. The Emperor's psychic abilities continued to evolve throughout the Great Crusade, adapting to new challenges and incorporating knowledge gained from encounters with alien psychers and chaos entities. His confrontations with the Eldar revealed new techniques for manipulating probability and fate, while his battles against Orkwa energies taught him methods for disrupting collective psychic phenomena. Each encounter added to his already vast repertoire of abilities, making him an increasingly formidable opponent for any force that dared challenge humanity's expansion. His mastery over technology extended beyond mere understanding into the realm of direct psychic interface with machine systems. The Emperor could communicate with artificial intelligences and machine spirits through direct mental contact, often resolving technical problems that would have required hours of conventional troubleshooting. This ability proved particularly valuable when dealing with Dark Age technology artifacts, whose complex systems often responded better to psychic interface than to traditional mechanical controls. The creation of the Astronomicon represented perhaps the Emperor's most ambitious application of psychic power for practical purposes. This psychic lighthouse required him to maintain a constant beacon of mental energy that could penetrate the chaotic currents of the warp and provide navigation reference points for Imperial vessels throughout the galaxy. The power requirements for such a feat exceeded the capabilities of any other known psyker, demanding a level of sustained psychic output that would have burned out lesser minds within moments. The genetic templates that would eventually become the Primarchs represented the culmination of the Emperor's millennia-long study of human biology and psychic potential. Each of the 20 genetic patterns he crafted in his Himalaysian laboratories contained not merely enhanced physical characteristics, but fragments of his own psychic essence carefully woven into their developing consciousness. This process created beings who were simultaneously his biological offspring and extensions of his own supernatural abilities, designed to serve as both military commanders and living embodiments of humanity's evolutionary potential. The psychic bond between the Emperor and his Primarch sons operated on levels that transcended conventional understanding of genetic inheritance. Where ordinary fathers might pass on physical traits or behavioral tendencies to their children, the Emperor had implanted actual portions of his consciousness into each Primarch's developing mind. This connection manifested as an intuitive understanding of warfare, leadership, and human nature that could not be acquired through education or experience alone. Each Primarch possessed an innate comprehension of their intended role in the Great Crusade, even though they would awaken on alien worlds far from their father's direct guidance. The 20 distinct genetic templates reflected the Emperor's strategic analysis of the challenges that would face humanity during its galactic expansion. Some Primarchs were optimized for siege warfare, their enhanced intellects capable of analyzing complex fortifications and devising methods to breach seemingly impregnable defenses. Others were designed as masters of rapid assault, their genetic modifications emphasizing speed, aggression, and the ability to strike decisive blows before enemies could organize effective resistance. Still others were crafted for specialized environments or combat roles, from void warfare specialists to experts in counterinsurgency operations. The Emperor's design philosophy for each Primarch incorporated not only their intended military function, but also the psychological profiles that would make them effective leaders of the Space Marine legions. He understood that commanding superhuman warriors across decades of continuous campaigning would require individuals who possessed both tactical brilliance and the charismatic authority necessary to maintain discipline and morale under extreme conditions. Each Primarch received genetic modifications that enhanced their natural leadership abilities, making them instinctively capable of inspiring loyalty and coordinating complex military operations. The tragic scattering of the Primarchs across the galaxy by the Chaos Gods created circumstances that would profoundly influence their development and eventual reunion with their father. Rather than awakening in the controlled environment of Terra under the Emperor's direct supervision, each Primarch found themselves on worlds with unique cultures, challenges, and environmental conditions that shaped their personalities and abilities in ways the Emperor had not anticipated. This uncontrolled development introduced variables into their psychological makeup that would have far-reaching consequences for the Great Crusade. The rediscovery process began during the early decades of the Great Crusade, as Imperial expeditionary fleets encountered worlds where the Emperor's psychic senses detected the unmistakable presence of his lost sons. The reunion of each Primarch with their father represented a moment of profound significance, as the psychic bond that had been severed by their scattering was reestablished and strengthened. These encounters varied dramatically in their circumstances and emotional impact, reflecting both the individual personalities that had developed during their separation and the specific conditions of their respective worlds. Horus was the first Primarch to be discovered, found on the world of Thonia, where he had risen to become the dominant gang leader in a society built around mining operations and tribal warfare. His natural charisma and tactical brilliance had allowed him to unite the fractious gangs under his leadership, demonstrating the leadership qualities that the Emperor had designed into his genetic template. The reunion between father and son was marked by immediate mutual recognition and respect, as Horus instinctively understood his role in the Emperor's grand design, while the Emperor recognized in his son the qualities that would make him the ideal war master. The discovery of each subsequent Primarch followed similar patterns of psychic recognition and emotional reunion, though the specific circumstances varied widely based on the conditions they had encountered on their adoptive worlds. Leman Russ had become a legendary warrior king among the tribal societies of Fenris, his savage upbringing tempering his genetic modifications with a fierce independence and loyalty to his chosen pack. Ferrus Manus had mastered the technological mysteries of Medusa, his hands replaced with living metal that demonstrated his affinity for the mechanical arts that would define his legion's character. The Emperor approached each reunion with careful consideration of his son's individual development and the psychological adjustments that would be necessary to integrate them into the Great Crusade's command structure. He understood that these beings, while genetically his offspring, had developed distinct personalities and worldviews during their formative years that could not simply be overwritten or ignored. The process of reintegration required delicate handling to preserve their individual strengths while ensuring their loyalty to the Imperial cause. Some Primarchs adapted more readily to their reunion with their father and their new role in the Great Crusade. Guilliman had already established a functioning interstellar empire on Ultramar, demonstrating administrative and strategic capabilities that aligned perfectly with the Emperor's vision for post-conquest governance. His adoption of imperial ideals was seamless, as his own philosophical development had led him to conclusions that closely paralleled the imperial truth. The Emperor recognized in Guilliman a son who could serve not only as a military commander, but as a model for how conquered worlds should be integrated into the growing Imperium. Other Primarchs presented greater challenges in their reintegration process. Angron had been discovered as a gladiator slave on Nuceria, his psyche scarred by the butcher's nails implants that had been forced into his brain by his captors. The cybernetic devices enhanced his aggression and combat effectiveness, but at the cost of his emotional stability and capacity for strategic thinking. The Emperor's decision to extract Angron from Nuceria, without allowing him to complete his rebellion alongside his fellow gladiators, created a resentment that would never fully heal, as the Primarch felt that his father had abandoned his closest companions to death and slavery. The Emperor's relationship with each Primarch reflected his understanding of their individual psychological needs and the strategic requirements of their assigned roles. With sons like Horus and Sanguinius, he maintained close personal relationships that emphasized their importance to his grand design and their special status among their brothers. These favored sons received additional attention and guidance, as the Emperor recognized their potential to serve as leaders and examples for their siblings. His investment in their development paid dividends as both Primarchs became influential figures who helped maintain unity among the scattered Legion forces. His treatment of other Primarchs was more distant and functional, focusing on their military effectiveness rather than personal development. Perdurabo received assignments that emphasized his expertise in siege warfare and fortification, but the Emperor's failure to recognize his son's need for acknowledgement and appreciation created a growing bitterness that would eventually contribute to his fall to chaos. The Iron Warriors Primarch possessed exceptional technical skills and strategic acumen, but his psychological needs for recognition and respect were consistently overlooked in favor of his practical utility. The Emperor's favoritism towards certain Primarchs created tensions within the group that he either failed to recognize or chose to ignore in favor of short-term strategic advantages. His obvious preference for Horus as his chosen successor generated resentment among Primarchs who felt their own contributions were undervalued or overlooked. These emotional undercurrents were exacerbated by the competitive nature that the Emperor had deliberately engineered into their genetic makeup, as each Primarch possessed an innate drive to excel and surpass their brothers in their chosen specializations. The complex dynamics between the Emperor and his sons were further complicated by his deliberate emotional distance and secretive nature regarding his long-term plans. While he shared strategic objectives and tactical requirements with his primarchs, he rarely explained the deeper reasoning behind his decisions or the existential threats that motivated his actions. This secrecy was partly motivated by his understanding that knowledge of chaos and the warp's dangers could itself become a source of corruption, but it also reflected his fundamental difficulty in relating to beings who, despite their genetic connection to him, had developed as individuals with their own emotional needs and psychological vulnerabilities. The Emperor's treatment of Magnus the Red exemplified both his genuine affection for his sons and his willingness to sacrifice their individual welfare for the greater good of humanity. Magnus had developed powerful psychic abilities during his time on Prospero, creating a civilization that embraced the study and application of warp-based powers. The Emperor recognized his son's exceptional psychic potential and initially encouraged his development, seeing in Magnus a possible successor who could eventually take over the burden of maintaining the astronomican and guiding humanity's evolution into a psychic species. However, the Emperor's simultaneous prohibition against the use of psychic powers by the Space Marine legions created a fundamental contradiction that Magnus struggled to understand. The Council of Nicaea's condemnation of psyker practices within the legions was intended to protect them from chaos corruption, but Magnus interpreted it as a rejection of his life's work and a betrayal of the potential that his father had originally encouraged him to develop. This misunderstanding would eventually lead to the catastrophic breach of the imperial palaces, psychic defenses, and Magnus's fall to chaos, representing one of the Emperor's greatest failures in managing his relationships with his sons. The Emperor's interactions with Lorgar revealed another aspect of his complex relationship with the Primarchs and his struggle to balance their individual development with the requirements of the imperial truth. Lorgar's deeply religious nature and his tendency to worship the Emperor as a divine figure directly contradicted the secular philosophy that formed the foundation of imperial ideology. The Emperor's harsh response to Lorgar's construction of temples and religious practices was intended to redirect his son's energies toward more productive pursuits, but the public humiliation inflicted during the Monarchia incident created lasting resentment and spiritual crisis that would eventually drive the Word-Bearer's Primarch toward chaos worship. The tragedy of the Emperor's relationship with his Primarch sons lay not in any lack of affection or concern for their welfare, but in his inability to balance their individual psychological needs with the strategic requirements of the Great Crusade and humanity's long-term survival. His vast intellect and temporal perception allowed him to see the consequences of galactic-scale decisions across millennia, but this same perspective made it difficult for him to appreciate the immediate emotional needs of beings who, despite their superhuman capabilities, retained fundamentally human psychological requirements for recognition, understanding, and emotional connection. The Emperor's secrecy regarding the true nature of chaos and the existential threats facing humanity was motivated by genuine concern for his son's spiritual safety, but it also deprived them of the context necessary to understand his decisions and priorities. Without knowledge of the Chaos God's influence and the dangers posed by warp corruption, many Primarchs interpreted their father's restrictions and prohibitions as arbitrary exercises of authority rather than necessary precautions against cosmic-level threats. This lack of understanding created fertile ground for the resentments and misunderstandings that would eventually be exploited by chaos agents seeking to turn the Primarchs against their father. The Emperor's emotional distance from his sons reflected both his inhuman perspective on temporal scales and his recognition that excessive attachment might compromise his ability to make the harsh decisions necessary for humanity's survival. He understood that the Great Crusade would require sacrifices from all participants, including his beloved Primarchs, and that his role as humanity's guardian might occasionally require him to prioritize the species' welfare over his son's individual happiness or desires. This utilitarian approach to relationships, while strategically sound, failed to account for the psychological damage that such treatment inflicted on beings who had been designed to crave their father's approval and recognition. The irony of the emperor's relationship with his Primarch sons was that his very attempts to protect them from corruption and guide them toward their intended roles often created the psychological vulnerabilities that chaos would eventually exploit. His secrecy bred suspicion and resentment, his favoritism created jealousy and competition, and his emotional distance left many Primarchs feeling abandoned and unappreciated, despite their extraordinary achievements in service to the imperial cause. The Horus Heresy would ultimately represent not just a military rebellion against imperial authority, but a family tragedy on a galactic scale, as half of the Emperor's sons turned against him in a conflict that would shatter the unity he had worked millennia to achieve. The Emperor's militant atheism emerged from his unique perspective as humanity's oldest living witness to the relationship between religious fervor and supernatural corruption. Having observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across millennia, he had witnessed firsthand how organized religion consistently empowered the very entities that sought to destroy humanity. Every prayer offered in desperation, every ritual performed in ignorance, and every act of worship conducted in fear-fed psychic energy directly into the warp, strengthening the chaos gods and their demonic servants. This understanding formed the cornerstone of his conviction that religion represented humanity's greatest weakness and most dangerous vulnerability. The imperial truth emerged as the emperor's philosophical weapon against this cosmic threat, a carefully constructed secular ideology designed to starve the chaos gods of the emotional and psychic sustenance they required. According to this doctrine, the universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood through rational inquiry and scientific investigation. Supernatural phenomena were merely manifestations of forces that had not yet been properly categorized and explained by human knowledge. Even the Emperor's own obvious psychic abilities were presented as advanced evolutionary developments rather than divine gifts, part of humanity's natural progression toward a more sophisticated understanding of reality's fundamental mechanisms. The implementation of the imperial truth required more than mere philosophical arguments. It demanded the systematic dismantling of existing religious structures that had taken root during humanity's expansion across the galaxy. During the Great Crusade, imperial forces encountered worlds where religious institutions had become the primary organizing principle of entire civilizations. These societies often possessed advanced technologies and sophisticated cultures, but their spiritual beliefs made them inherently dangerous to the Emperor's long-term vision for humanity's development. The planet Colchis served as an early example of how the Emperor's forces dealt with deeply religious human societies. The Word-Bearer's Legion, under Lorgar's command, had initially approached the world with the intention of incorporating its religious traditions into imperial doctrine. The Colchians worshipped a pantheon of deities that bore uncomfortable resemblances to the chaos gods, though their practitioners remained ignorant of this connection. Lorgar's natural religious inclinations led him to see potential for synthesis between Colchian beliefs and his own worship of the Emperor, but the imperial truth's absolute rejection of supernatural beliefs left no room for such accommodation. The compliance of Colchis became a template for how imperial forces would handle similar situations throughout the Great Crusade. Religious texts were confiscated and destroyed, temples were demolished or converted to secular purposes, and religious leaders were either executed or forced to renounce their beliefs publicly. The population was subjected to intensive re-education programs designed to replace their spiritual worldview with the rational materialism of the imperial truth. Those who resisted this ideological transformation were classified as enemies of human progress and dealt with accordingly. The Emperor's personal involvement in these religious purges demonstrated his absolute commitment to eradicating supernatural beliefs from human consciousness. On worlds where particularly entrenched religious institutions resisted imperial compliance, he would often deploy personally to oversee their destruction. His psychic abilities allowed him to identify individuals whose faith was so deeply rooted that conventional re-education would prove ineffective. These zealots were eliminated without mercy, as the emperor understood that their continued existence posed an existential threat to humanity's spiritual safety. The systematic destruction of religious artifacts represented another crucial component of the imperial truth's implementation. Ancient texts, sacred relics, and ceremonial objects that might serve as focal points for religious devotion were located and destroyed by specialized imperial units. The emperor recognized that physical objects could serve as conduits for warp energy, particularly when they had been the focus of sustained worship or ritual activity. Even seemingly innocent religious artwork was deemed dangerous, as it might inspire renewed spiritual sentiment among populations that had been successfully converted to secular thinking. The contradiction between the emperor's denial of his own divinity and his obvious god-like capabilities created persistent challenges for the imperial truth's credibility. His superhuman abilities, immortal lifespan, and capacity to perform feats that defied natural law made it difficult for many humans to accept purely scientific explanations for his existence. Imperial propagandists worked constantly to frame the emperor's powers in terms of advanced human evolution and scientific achievement, but the gap between these explanations and observable reality remained problematic throughout the Great Crusade. The emperor's insistence on absolute obedience, while simultaneously rejecting worship, created a delicate semantic distinction that many followers found difficult to navigate. Imperial doctrine demanded complete submission to the emperor's will and unquestioning acceptance of his authority, but this submission was characterized as rational recognition of his superior capabilities rather than religious devotion. Citizens were expected to obey the emperor not because he was divine, but because his enhanced intellect and temporal perspective made his decisions objectively superior to those of ordinary humans. This distinction became increasingly strained as imperial ceremonies and rituals began to resemble religious practices in all but name. The elaborate protocols surrounding the emperor's public appearances, the reverent manner in which his images were displayed throughout imperial space, and the quasi-liturgical language used in official proclamations all suggested a form of worship despite official denials. The emperor tolerated these developments because they served practical purposes in maintaining imperial unity and authority, but their resemblance to religious practices created cognitive dissonance among populations trying to understand the difference between acceptable reverence and forbidden worship. The suppression of religious expression created unexpected psychological pressures within human populations that had been converted to the imperial truth. Many individuals who had previously found meaning and comfort in spiritual beliefs struggled to adapt to a purely materialistic worldview that offered no transcendent purpose or hope for existence beyond death. The imperial truth's emphasis on human achievement and rational progress provided some substitute for religious meaning, but it could not address the fundamental existential questions that had driven humanity towards spiritual beliefs throughout its history. These psychological vulnerabilities became apparent during the later stages of the Great Crusade, as imperial forces encountered increasing instances of chaos corruption among populations that had been successfully converted to secular thinking. The suppression of traditional religious outlets had not eliminated humanity's spiritual needs. Instead, it had created a vacuum that chaos entities could exploit through more subtle forms of corruption. Individuals who had been denied conventional religious expression became susceptible to chaos cults that presented themselves as scientific societies or philosophical movements rather than explicitly supernatural organizations. The planet Davin illustrated how the imperial truth's limitations could be exploited by chaos agents seeking to corrupt imperial forces. The world's population had been successfully converted to secular thinking and integrated into the imperial system, but underlying spiritual tensions remained unresolved. When chaos cultists established themselves on Davin, they avoided overt religious symbolism in favor of presenting their beliefs as advanced scientific theories about the nature of reality. This approach proved devastatingly effective, as it bypassed the psychological defenses that imperial indoctrination had established against traditional religious corruption. The Emperor's prohibition against the study of warp phenomena by Imperial forces created additional vulnerabilities that chaos could exploit. The Imperial Truth's insistence that supernatural phenomena were merely misunderstood natural forces prevented Imperial scholars and military personnel from developing effective defenses against chaos corruption. Without proper understanding of how demonic entities operated or how warp energy could be manipulated, Imperial forces remained vulnerable to threats that they were forbidden to acknowledge or study. The Council of Nicaea represented the Emperor's most comprehensive attempt to address the growing problem of psychic corruption within the Space Marine legions, while maintaining the integrity of the Imperial truth. The Council was convened to determine whether the legions should be permitted to employ psychers and study warp-based phenomena, or whether such activities posed unacceptable risks to Imperial forces. The Emperor's decision to prohibit psychic practices within the legions reflected his understanding that untrained psychers could serve as conduits for demonic possession, but it also demonstrated the limitations of the Imperial Truth's approach to supernatural threats. Magnus, the Red's passionate defense of psychic study at the Council of Nicaea highlighted the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Imperial Truth. The Thousand Sons Primarch argued that understanding warp phenomena was essential for defending against chaos corruption, and that ignorance would leave humanity vulnerable to threats they could not recognize or counter. His arguments possessed considerable merit from a purely tactical standpoint, but they conflicted with the Emperor's determination to prevent any form of supernatural belief from taking root within Imperial forces. The Emperor's rejection of Magnus's arguments and his prohibition of psychic practices created resentment among those legions that had previously employed psychers effectively. The White Scars, Space Wolves, and other legions were forced to abandon techniques that had served them well during compliance campaigns, leaving them feeling handicapped in their military effectiveness. This resentment was compounded by the Emperor's failure to explain the reasoning behind his decision, as providing such explanations would have required acknowledging the existence of chaos and thereby undermining the Imperial Truth's fundamental premises. The unintended consequences of religious suppression became most apparent in the development of emperor worship among imperial populations. Despite official prohibition of such beliefs, many humans found it impossible to view the emperor as anything other than a divine figure worthy of worship. His miraculous abilities, eternal lifespan, and role as humanity's savior made him a natural focus for religious devotion that could not be eliminated through mere ideological instruction. This worship often took forms that were carefully disguised as secular reverence, but the underlying spiritual content remained unchanged. The growth of emperor worship created a paradoxical situation where the imperial truth's most fundamental principle was being violated by the very populations it was designed to protect. The emperor's attempts to discourage such worship were largely ineffective, as his denials of divinity were interpreted by believers as evidence of his divine humility rather than literal truth. The more he insisted on his mortality and humanity, the more his followers saw confirmation of his godlike nature in his refusal to claim the worship he obviously deserved. This development posed serious long-term risks to the emperor's strategy for starving the chaos gods of psychic energy. Emperor worship, regardless of its specific theological content, generated the same type of emotional and psychic emanations that fed warp entities. While the emperor himself might not be corrupted by such worship, the psychic energy it produced could be intercepted and consumed by chaos entities seeking to strengthen themselves at humanity's expense. The imperial truth's failure to prevent emperor worship represented a fundamental flaw in the emperor's approach to protecting humanity from chaos corruption. The military effectiveness of imperial forces was also compromised by their ignorance of chaos threats and supernatural phenomena. Commanders who encountered obviously demonic entities were forced to classify them as unknown alien species or unexplained natural phenomena, preventing them from developing appropriate tactical responses. The imperial truth's prohibition against acknowledging supernatural threats left imperial forces unprepared for enemies that operated according to rules that contradicted materialistic assumptions about reality. The Word-Bearer's Legion's eventual fall to chaos worship demonstrated how the suppression of religious expression could create psychological pressures that made individuals more susceptible to corruption rather than less. Lorger's deep spiritual needs had been frustrated by the Emperor's rejection of his religious devotion, creating a void that chaos entities were able to exploit. The Primarch's turn toward chaos worship represented not a rejection of his father's teachings, but a desperate attempt to find the spiritual meaning that the imperial truth had denied him. The Emperor's personal struggle with the contradictions inherent in the imperial truth became increasingly apparent as the Great Crusade progressed. His own obvious supernatural abilities made it difficult to maintain credible denials of divine nature, while his need for absolute authority required forms of reverence that closely resembled religious worship. The practical requirements of governing a galaxy spanning empire often conflicted with the ideological purity that the imperial truth demanded, forcing him to make compromises that weakened his philosophical position. The failure of the imperial truth to provide adequate spiritual fulfillment for human populations created opportunities for chaos corruption that the Emperor had not anticipated. Rather than eliminating humanity's vulnerability to supernatural influence, the suppression of traditional religious expression had simply redirected spiritual energies into channels that were less visible but potentially more dangerous. The Horus Heresy would ultimately demonstrate that the Emperor's war against religion had failed to achieve its primary objective of protecting humanity from chaos corruption, and had instead created new vulnerabilities that his enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Emperor's discovery of the ancient Eldar webway beneath Terra occurred during the final phases of the Unification Wars, when his psychic senses detected vast corridors of structured reality hidden deep within the planet's crust. These passages, carved from the fabric of the warp itself by the Eldar at the height of their galactic dominance, represented a form of travel that bypassed the chaotic currents of the Imperium while still utilizing its fundamental properties. The webway tunnels existed in a carefully maintained pocket dimension that remained stable and predictable, allowing near instantaneous travel across vast distances without exposure to the predatory entities that haunted the deeper regions of the warp. The implications of this discovery transformed the Emperor's entire strategic vision for humanity's future. The Great Crusade's reliance on conventional warp travel exposed every Imperial vessel to the constant threat of demonic attack, chaos corruption, and the unpredictable storms that could strand fleets for months or years in hostile regions of the galaxy. Navigator houses maintained their monopoly on interstellar travel through their unique ability to perceive the warp's currents, but even their enhanced vision could not guarantee safe passage through the increasingly turbulent Imperium. The webway offered an alternative that would free humanity from these limitations and provide a secure foundation for the species' continued expansion. The Emperor's initial explorations of the webway revealed a network of staggering complexity and sophistication. The Eldar had constructed thousands of interconnected passages that linked major population centers across the galaxy, creating a transportation system that had enabled their ancient empire to maintain coherent administration across millions of worlds. Many of these passages had fallen into disrepair following the catastrophic birth of Slaanesh and the collapse of Eldar civilization, but the fundamental infrastructure remained intact and potentially functional. The Emperor recognized that gaining access to this network would provide humanity with strategic advantages that could ensure the species' dominance for millennia to come. However, the webway's alien construction presented significant challenges for human utilization. The passages had been designed specifically for Eldar physiology and psychology, incorporating psychic resonance patterns that were incompatible with human consciousness. The dimensional anchors that maintained the tunnel's stability were attuned to Eldar psychic signatures, while the navigation systems required forms of perception that baseline humans did not possess. Simply accessing existing webway passages would not be sufficient, the Emperor would need to construct new sections specifically designed for human use while maintaining compatibility with the broader network. The technical requirements for this undertaking exceeded anything the Emperor had previously attempted. Creating stable passages through the warp required precise manipulation of dimensional boundaries that existed at the intersection of real space and the Imperium. The Emperor's psychic abilities allowed him to perceive and influence these boundaries directly, but the scale of construction necessary for a human-accessible webway network would demand sustained effort over decades or centuries. Each new tunnel required constant psychic maintenance to prevent collapse or invasion by warp entities seeking to breach the dimensional barriers. The Emperor established his primary construction site beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, where existing Eldar passages provided connection points to the broader webway network. The ancient alien tunnels converged at several key junctions deep within Terra's crust, creating natural expansion points where human-built sections could be integrated with the existing infrastructure. The Emperor's engineers, working under his direct supervision, began the delicate process of extending these passages while maintaining the dimensional stability that kept them isolated from the warp's chaotic energies. The construction process required technologies that pushed the boundaries of human understanding even during the height of the Great Crusade. Dimensional anchor points had to be precisely positioned to maintain the mathematical relationships that kept webway passages stable, while psychic resonance chambers were constructed to channel the Emperor's consciousness throughout the growing network. Each section of new tunnel required individual calibration to ensure compatibility with human physiology, as the slightest miscalculation could result in passages that were lethal to anyone attempting to use them. The Emperor's personal involvement in the construction process was absolute and unrelenting. His consciousness existed simultaneously throughout the developing network, maintaining the psychic barriers that prevented warp entities from detecting or infiltrating the new passages. This constant vigilance required him to dedicate enormous portions of his mental capacity to the project, limiting his ability to personally oversee other aspects of the Great Crusade. The demands of webway construction forced him to rely increasingly on his Primarch sons and other subordinates to manage military operations while he focused on humanity's long-term survival. The scale of psychic effort required for the webway project became apparent as construction progressed beyond the initial experimental phases. Each new passage demanded continuous psychic reinforcement to maintain its dimensional integrity, while the connection points between human and Eldar sections required constant monitoring to prevent incompatibility issues from causing catastrophic failures. The Emperor found himself functioning as a living keystone for the entire network, his consciousness spread across thousands of kilometers of interdimensional passages that existed only through his sustained will. The project's energy requirements grew exponentially as the network expanded beyond Terra's immediate vicinity. Creating passages that could reach other star systems required the Emperor to project his psychic influence across interstellar distances while maintaining the precise control necessary to prevent dimensional collapse. The strain of this effort began to affect his physical presence, as increasing portions of his consciousness became dedicated to maintaining the webway's stability rather than interacting with the material universe. The Emperor's long-term vision for the webway project extended far beyond mere transportation improvements. He intended the network to serve as the foundation for humanity's evolution into a fully psychic species, capable of safely navigating the warp without succumbing to chaos corruption. The controlled environment within the webway passages would provide ideal conditions for developing and testing psychic abilities, while the network's isolation from the broader warp would protect human psychers from demonic influence during their training and development. This evolutionary transformation represented the ultimate goal of the Emperor's millennia-long guidance of human development. The species' growing psychic potential had made them increasingly vulnerable to chaos corruption, but this same potential could become their greatest strength if properly channeled and controlled. A fully psychic humanity would be capable of defending itself against any threat the galaxy could produce, while their mastery of warp-based technologies would enable them to surpass even the ancient Eldar in their manipulation of reality's fundamental forces. The Webway network would serve as both the catalyst and the protective environment for this transformation. Human psychers could develop their abilities within the passage's controlled conditions, learning to manipulate psychic energy without risking possession or corruption by chaos entities. The network's dimensional isolation would allow for experimentation with psychic techniques that would be too dangerous to attempt in normal space, while the Emperor's constant presence within the passages would provide guidance and protection for developing psychers. The Emperor's plans for psychic education within the Webway involved the establishment of training facilities at key junctions throughout the network. These installations would serve as academies where human psychers could learn to harness their abilities under carefully controlled conditions. The curriculum would combine theoretical instruction in warp manipulation with practical exercises designed to strengthen psychic defenses against chaos corruption. Advanced students would eventually become teachers themselves, creating a self-sustaining system for psychic education that could expand alongside humanity's growing population. The strategic implications of a psychically awakened humanity extended beyond mere military advantages. A species capable of manipulating reality through conscious will could reshape the galaxy according to their needs and desires, creating paradise worlds and eliminating the resource scarcity that had driven much of human conflict throughout history. The Emperor envisioned human psychers working in concert to terraform entire star systems, creating optimal conditions for human habitation while eliminating the environmental challenges that had limited population growth on many Imperial worlds. The Webway's role in this transformation would be crucial for maintaining the unity and coordination necessary for such large-scale projects. Psychic communication through the network would enable instantaneous coordination between human populations across the galaxy, eliminating the communication delays that had plagued previous attempts at galactic governance. The Emperor himself would serve as the central node for this communication network, his consciousness providing the stability and authority necessary to prevent the chaos that might otherwise result from millions of individual psychers attempting to coordinate their efforts. However, the Webway project's success depended entirely on the Emperor's continued personal involvement in maintaining the network's stability. The passages existed only through his sustained psychic effort, and any significant disruption to his concentration could result in catastrophic collapse that would destroy years of construction work. This dependency created a critical vulnerability that the Emperor was acutely aware of, but could not eliminate without fundamentally altering the project's design parameters. The Emperor's increasing isolation from day-to-day Imperial affairs resulted directly from the Webway project's demands on his attention and psychic resources. As more passages came online and the network's complexity increased, he found himself spending longer periods in deep psychic communion with the dimensional barriers that kept the tunnels stable. His physical presence became increasingly rare at Imperial ceremonies and military briefings, as his consciousness was occupied with maintaining the delicate balance that prevented warp entities from detecting and attacking the growing network. This isolation had profound effects on the Emperor's relationships with his Primarch sons and other key Imperial figures. Many began to feel abandoned by their father and leader, unable to understand why he had withdrawn from active participation in the Great Crusade at the moment of its greatest triumphs. The Emperor's inability to explain the true nature of his work created resentment and confusion among those who had grown accustomed to his direct guidance and involvement in their campaigns. The secrecy surrounding the Webway project was essential for its success, as widespread knowledge of its existence would have attracted unwanted attention from both chaos entities and hostile alien species. The Emperor could not risk revealing his plans even to his most trusted subordinates, as any leak of information could result in attacks specifically designed to disrupt the construction process. This necessary secrecy further increased his isolation and contributed to the growing sense among imperial leadership that their master had lost interest in the empire he had spent millennia building. The project's timeline extended far beyond the duration of the Great Crusade, requiring sustained effort over centuries or millennia to create a network comprehensive enough to serve humanity's long-term needs. The Emperor understood that the initial phases of construction would need to be completed before humanity's psychic evolution reached critical levels, as uncontrolled psychic awakening could result in massive chaos corruption if suitable protective measures were not already in place. The race between the project's completion and humanity's natural psychic development created enormous pressure to accelerate construction regardless of the personal cost to the Emperor himself. The webway's potential to revolutionize human civilization extended beyond transportation and communication to encompass fundamental changes in how the species related to the physical universe. Access to stable warp passages would enable the development of technologies that manipulated reality at the quantum level, allowing for matter transmission, temporal manipulation, and other capabilities that had previously been limited to the most advanced psychers. The Emperor envisioned human engineers working within the webway to develop tools and weapons that would make the species invincible against any conceivable threat. The project's success would also eliminate humanity's dependence on the navigator houses and their monopoly over interstellar travel. The webway network would provide reliable transportation that did not require specialized genetic mutations or decades of training to utilize safely. This democratization of galactic travel would enable massive population movements and resource redistribution that could eliminate the inequality and scarcity that had plagued human civilization throughout its history. The Emperor's vision encompassed the eventual expansion of the webway network beyond the Milky Way galaxy itself, creating passages that could reach other galaxies and enable humanity's expansion into previously inaccessible regions of the universe. This ultimate goal represented the fulfillment of humanity's destiny as the dominant species in existence, capable of spreading their influence across all of creation through the mastery of interdimensional travel and psychic manipulation. The growing schism within the Space Marine legions regarding the use of psychic powers had been festering for decades before it reached a critical mass that demanded the Emperor's direct intervention. The divide centered around two fundamentally opposed philosophies, represented by Magnus, the Red of the Thousand Suns, and Mortarion of the Death Guard. Magnus viewed psychic abilities as humanity's natural evolutionary path, a tool that could be refined through study and discipline to serve the Imperium's expansion across the galaxy. His Thousand Suns had developed sophisticated techniques for channeling warp energy, creating battle psychers whose abilities complemented their already formidable combat capabilities with devastating psychic attacks and defensive barriers. Mortarion's position reflected a deep-seated revulsion toward anything connected to the warp and its chaotic energies. The Death Guard Primarch had witnessed firsthand the corruption that psychic powers could bring, having fought against the necromantic overlords of Barbarus, who wielded similar abilities to maintain their tyrannical rule over his adoptive homeworld. His experiences had convinced him that any use of warp-based powers inevitably led to corruption and damnation, regardless of the user's intentions or precautions. The Death Guard maintained strict prohibitions against psychers within their ranks, viewing such individuals as potential vectors for the very corruption they had sworn to combat. The debate between these opposing viewpoints had spread throughout the legions, creating factions that supported either unrestricted psychic development or complete prohibition of warp-based abilities. The White Scars employed their Stormseers in traditional shamanic roles that predated their integration into the Imperium, while the Space Wolves maintained their rune priests, who claimed their powers derived from Fenris itself rather than the warp. Other legions found themselves internally divided, with some companies embracing psychic techniques while others rejected them entirely, creating operational inconsistencies that threatened unit cohesion during joint campaigns. The Emperor observed these developments with growing concern, recognizing that the uncontrolled proliferation of psychic practices within the legions posed significant risks to the Great Crusade's continued success. His own experiences with warp entities and chaos corruption had taught him that untrained psykers could serve as conduits for demonic possession, potentially turning entire space marine companies into unwitting servants of humanity's greatest enemies. The specialized training required to safely utilize psychic abilities could not be easily standardized across the diverse cultures and recruitment practices of the different legions, creating inconsistencies in safety protocols that left gaps for chaos exploitation. The Council of Nicaea was convened on the world of the same name during the 31st millennium, bringing together representatives from all space marine legions to address the growing controversy surrounding psychic practices. The Emperor's decision to hold the council demonstrated his recognition that the issue required definitive resolution before it could further undermine legion unity and effectiveness. The gathering included not only the Primarchs and their senior commanders, but also representatives from the Imperial Army, the Mechanicum, and other key Imperial institutions that would be affected by any decision regarding psychic warfare. The Council's proceedings revealed the depth of disagreement within the Imperial hierarchy regarding the proper role of psychic abilities in military operations. Magnus, the Red, presented detailed arguments supporting the continued development of psychic techniques, citing numerous examples of how Thousand Sons battle psykers had contributed to successful compliance campaigns. He demonstrated advanced psychic abilities during his presentations, showing how properly trained psykers could neutralize enemy fortifications, disrupt alien communication networks, and provide tactical advantages that conventional weapons could not match. His arguments emphasized the scientific approach that the Thousand Sons had developed for studying warp phenomena, presenting psychic abilities as natural forces that could be understood and controlled through rational inquiry. Mortarian's counter-arguments focused on the inherent dangers of warp manipulation and the corrupting influence that psychic powers exerted on their users. He presented evidence of psyker-related incidents throughout the Great Crusade, documenting cases where untrained or inadequately supervised psykers had succumbed to possession or madness during combat operations. The Death Guard Primarch argued that no amount of training or precaution could eliminate the fundamental risk posed by opening human minds to warp influence, and that the potential benefits of psychic warfare were far outweighed by the catastrophic consequences of widespread chaos corruption within the legions. The Emperor listened to both sides of the debate with apparent neutrality, allowing each faction to present their arguments without immediate judgment or commentary. His silence during the proceedings created tension among the assembled delegates, as many had expected him to provide clear guidance on an issue that had divided the legions for decades. The Primarchs, who had developed close relationships with their father, searched his expression for hints of his eventual decision, but the Emperor's features remained impassive throughout the lengthy presentations and heated exchanges between opposing factions. The Council's deliberations extended over several days, with detailed examinations of specific incidents where psychic abilities had either contributed to Imperial victories or resulted in catastrophic failures. The Thousand Sons presented case studies of successful psychic operations, while the Death Guard documented instances of corruption and possession that had required extensive purification efforts to contain. Other legions contributed their own experiences, creating a comprehensive record of how psychic practices had affected Imperial military operations across hundreds of worlds and dozens of compliance campaigns. The Emperor's final pronouncement came without warning or preliminary discussion, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument or appeal. The Edict of Nicaea, as it became known, prohibited the use of psychic powers by Space Marine legions with immediate effect. All librarian departments were to be disbanded, psychic training programs terminated, and battle psykers reassigned to conventional combat roles within their respective legions. The edict applied universally to all legions regardless of their previous practices or cultural traditions, eliminating the inconsistencies that had created operational problems during joint campaigns. The Emperor's decision shocked many of the assembled delegates, particularly those from legions that had successfully integrated psychic abilities into their combat doctrines. Magnus, the Red, was visibly devastated by the ruling, having invested decades of effort in developing the Thousand Sons' psychic capabilities and believing that his father shared his vision of humanity's psychic evolution. The Crimson King's reaction revealed the depth of his commitment to psychic development and his inability to understand how the Emperor could reject what seemed like humanity's natural evolutionary path. The implementation of the Edict of Nicaea proceeded with characteristic imperial efficiency, though not without significant resistance from affected legions. The Thousand Sons faced the most dramatic changes, as their entire military doctrine had been built around the integration of psychic and conventional warfare techniques. Magnus struggled to adapt his legion's tactics to comply with the new restrictions while maintaining their effectiveness in combat operations. Many Thousand Sons battle brothers found themselves reassigned to roles that did not utilize their years of psychic training, creating morale problems and operational inefficiencies that persisted long after the edict's implementation. Other legions adapted more successfully to the new restrictions, though not without cost. The White Scars discontinued their Stormseer traditions, while the Space Wolves were forced to redefine their Rune Priests' roles to avoid explicit violation of the edict. Some legions interpreted the restrictions narrowly, maintaining that certain practices fell outside the edict's scope if they could be classified as cultural traditions rather than formal psychic training. These semantic distinctions created ongoing tensions with imperial oversight authorities who were tasked with ensuring compliance with the Emperor's decree. The underlying tensions that had prompted the Council of Nicaea did not disappear with the edict's implementation, instead being driven underground, where they continued to fester without official acknowledgement. Magnus, the Red's resentment toward his father's decision grew stronger over time, as he witnessed what he perceived as the deliberate crippling of humanity's psychic potential for reasons that remained unexplained. The Emperor's refusal to provide detailed justification for the edict left many Primarchs confused about the reasoning behind such a dramatic policy reversal, particularly given his previous tolerance for diverse legion practices. The Emperor's motivation for issuing the Edict of Nicaea stemmed from his deep understanding of the chaos threat and the specific vulnerabilities that psychic abilities created within military organizations. His temporal perception had revealed potential futures where uncontrolled psychic development within the legions led to massive chaos corruption that could destroy the Imperium from within. The risks posed by untrained or inadequately supervised psychers far outweighed any tactical advantages their abilities might provide, particularly given the increasing activity of chaos entities seeking to exploit human psychic potential for their own purposes. However, the Emperor's decision to prohibit psychic practices rather than establish comprehensive training protocols reflected his recognition that the resources required for proper psychic education could not be allocated, while the Great Crusade demanded the Legion's full attention. The Webway project consumed enormous amounts of his personal time and psychic energy, preventing him from establishing the educational institutions that would be necessary to safely develop psychic abilities throughout the Space Marine legions. The edict represented a temporary measure designed to eliminate immediate risks, while he focused on completing humanity's long-term salvation through interdimensional travel capabilities. Magnus the Red's violation of the Edict of Nicaea occurred during the early stages of the Horus Heresy, when his psychic abilities detected the corruption spreading through the War Master's forces. The Thousand Sons Primarch faced an impossible choice between maintaining his loyalty to his father's explicit commands and warning the Emperor of an existential threat to the Imperium. His decision to use psychic communication to contact Terra directly represented both a desperate attempt to serve the Imperial cause and a fundamental betrayal of the trust that the Emperor had placed in him by expecting compliance with the Nicaea restrictions. The psychic message that Magnus projected across the galaxy required him to channel enormous amounts of warp energy through his consciousness, creating a beacon of psychic activity that was visible to entities throughout the Imperium. His attempt to reach the Emperor's mind directly necessitated piercing the psychic barriers that protected Terra from chaos intrusion, barriers that had been carefully constructed over decades to prevent exactly the kind of breach that Magnus was attempting to create. The Crimson King's desperation to warn his father of Horus's treachery blinded him to the catastrophic consequences of his actions. The psychic assault that Magnus launched toward Terra struck the Imperial Palace's defenses with the force of a psychic tsunami, overwhelming protective wards that had been designed to repel far lesser intrusions. The message itself successfully reached the Emperor, delivering its warning about Horus's corruption and the impending rebellion that would tear the Imperium apart. However, the method of delivery proved catastrophically destructive to the Webway project that represented humanity's best hope for long-term survival against the chaos threat. The breach that Magnus created in Terra's psychic defenses extended directly into the Webway passages beneath the Imperial Palace, shattering dimensional barriers that the Emperor had spent decades carefully constructing and maintaining. The rupture allowed warp entities direct access to the interdimensional network, transforming the carefully controlled environment that was intended to protect humanity from chaos corruption into a highway for demonic invasion. Thousands of demons poured through the breach, establishing footholds within the Webway that would require constant military action to contain. The Emperor's reaction to Magnus's breach combined fury at his son's disobedience with devastation at the destruction of his life's greatest work. Decades of construction and psychic investment had been undone in moments by Magnus's well-intentioned but catastrophically executed warning. The Webway project, which had represented humanity's path to psychic evolution and freedom from warp travel's dangers, was now compromised beyond any hope of quick repair. The Emperor found himself forced to abandon his long-term plans for human development in favor of immediate damage control to prevent Terra itself from being overrun by demonic forces. The psychic energy required to contain the breach and prevent its expansion consumed the vast majority of the Emperor's consciousness, effectively ending his active participation in imperial governance and military operations. His physical form remained on Terra to maintain the barriers that kept the demon incursion from spreading beyond the Webway passages, while his psychic essence fought a constant battle against entities seeking to expand their foothold within the interdimensional network. The Emperor, who had once personally led armies across the galaxy, was now trapped in a static defensive position, his freedom of action permanently constrained by the need to prevent a catastrophe that would dwarf even the Horus Heresy's destruction. The irony of Magnus's situation became apparent as the consequences of his actions unfolded across the galaxy. His attempt to serve the Imperial cause by warning of Horus's treachery had inadvertently ensured that the War Master's rebellion would succeed by removing the Emperor from active opposition to the traitor forces. The Thousand Sons Primarch had violated his father's explicit commands in an attempt to demonstrate his loyalty, only to discover that his disobedience had caused far greater damage than simple compliance with the Edict of Nicaea could ever have inflicted. The Emperor's censure of the Thousand Sons Legion reflected both his personal disappointment in Magnus and his recognition that the breach could not be allowed to pass without consequences. The Legion that had once been among his most favored found themselves branded as traitors and marked for destruction, their Primarch's good intentions irrelevant in the face of the catastrophic damage his actions had caused. The Space Wolves were dispatched to Prospero with orders to bring Magnus to Terra for judgment, though the mission's true purpose extended beyond simple punishment to encompass the complete elimination of a legion that had proven itself incapable of following explicit Imperial directives. The burning of Prospero marked the beginning of the Emperor's complete withdrawal from the Great Crusade's active prosecution, though the galaxy would not understand the true reasons for his absence until it was far too late. As space wolf drop pods rained down upon the crystalline spires of the Thousand Sons homeworld, the Emperor found himself locked in an increasingly desperate battle beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra. The breach that Magnus had torn through the Webway's dimensional barriers continued to hemorrhage demonic entities into the carefully constructed passages, each new incursion requiring immediate psychic intervention to prevent the corruption from spreading throughout the entire network. The irony of the situation was not lost on the Emperor, whose enhanced temporal perception allowed him to see the cascading consequences of his son's well-intentioned betrayal. Magnus had sought to warn his father of Horus's corruption, but in doing so had effectively removed the Emperor from the very conflict he had been warned about. The psychic energy required to maintain the barriers around the webway breach consumed virtually all of the Emperor's consciousness, leaving him unable to personally intervene in the growing rebellion that was tearing the Imperium apart. His physical form remained seated upon the Golden Throne, that ancient dark age of technology artifact that amplified his psychic abilities and allowed him to project his consciousness across the dimensional barriers that separated real space from the warp. The Golden Throne itself had been discovered during the excavations beneath the Imperial Palace, its origins predating human civilization by millions of years. The device's creators remained unknown, though its sophisticated psychic amplification systems suggested a species with understanding of warp manipulation that rivaled or exceeded even the ancient Eldar. The Emperor had spent decades studying the throne's mechanisms, gradually learning to interface his consciousness with its arcane systems to enhance his already formidable psychic abilities. The device's integration with the webway's control systems had been essential for managing the network's expansion, but now it served as his prison as much as his tool. The demon incursion that poured through Magnus's breach represented threats that defied conventional military response. These were not physical entities that could be destroyed through bolter fire or chainsword strikes, but manifestations of pure chaos energy that existed partially in real space and partially within the warp itself. The creatures could phase between dimensions at will, appearing suddenly to strike at defenders before vanishing back into the immaterium when faced with effective resistance. Their very presence corrupted the webway's carefully maintained dimensional stability, creating expanding zones of chaotic energy that threatened to collapse entire sections of the network if left unchecked. The Emperor's battle against these entities required him to project his consciousness directly into the webway passages, where he fought a war of psychic energy and willpower against opponents that possessed no physical form to destroy. Each demon that manifested within the network had to be individually banished through focused psychic assault, a process that required precise application of force to avoid damaging the dimensional barriers that kept the passages stable. The constant vigilance necessary to detect and respond to new incursions meant that the Emperor could never fully withdraw his attention from the webway, effectively trapping him in an endless defensive campaign. The scale of the demon incursion grew steadily worse as chaos entities throughout the galaxy became aware of the breach in Terra's defenses. What had begun as a localized rupture in the webway's barriers gradually expanded into a major focal point for chaos activity, drawing demons from across the immaterium to assault the dimensional boundaries that protected humanity's homeworld. The Emperor found himself fighting not just the initial wave of entities that had poured through Magnus's breach, but a constantly reinforced army of chaos creatures that viewed the webway as a highway directly into the heart of the Imperium. The psychological toll of this endless battle began to manifest in ways that even the Emperor's superhuman constitution could not entirely resist. His consciousness, spread across thousands of kilometers of interdimensional passages, was forced to maintain simultaneous awareness of countless different threats while preserving the complex psychic constructs that kept the webway stable. The mental strain of coordinating these efforts while simultaneously banishing demon after demon created a level of psychic exhaustion that the Emperor had never previously experienced in his millennia of existence. The Emperor's physical form, seated upon the Golden Throne, began to show signs of the enormous psychic effort he was expending in the webway. His flesh grew pale and drawn, while his breathing became labored as increasing portions of his life force were channeled into maintaining the dimensional barriers. The ornate life support systems built into the throne's structure activated automatically, providing nutrients and oxygen to sustain his body, while his consciousness fought its desperate battle in another dimension. The sight of the master of mankind, reduced to such a state, would have shattered the morale of any imperial citizen who witnessed it, but the throne room remained sealed to all but the most essential personnel. The strategic implications of the emperor's incapacitation became apparent as reports reached Terra of Horus's growing rebellion. The War Master had revealed his corruption openly, turning fully half of the Space Marine legions against their oaths of loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium. Entire sectors of space fell under traitor control as the sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's children prosecuted their own version of the Great Crusade, spreading chaos corruption instead of imperial compliance. The Loyalist legions found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of imperial tactics and capabilities. Without the Emperor's direct leadership and strategic guidance, the imperial response to the heresy lacked the coordination and decisiveness that had characterized the Great Crusade's most successful campaigns. The Primarchs who remained loyal to the imperial cause were forced to make critical decisions without access to their father's temporal foresight and strategic brilliance. Rogaldorn fortified Terra against the inevitable siege, while Robute Guilliman attempted to organize the scattered loyalist forces into a coherent resistance movement. However, their efforts were hampered by communication delays, resource shortages, and the simple fact that they were facing opponents who had been their brothers and equals in terms of tactical capability. The Emperor's awareness of the growing crisis created a torment that exceeded even the physical strain of his battle within the webway. His enhanced perception allowed him to observe the consequences of his absence as they unfolded across the galaxy, watching helplessly as worlds that had been brought into imperial compliance through decades of effort fell to chaos corruption within months or weeks. The secular empire he had spent millennia building was collapsing into religious warfare and demonic possession, while the Space Marine legions that represented humanity's greatest military achievement turned their weapons against each other in a fratricidal conflict that would scar the galaxy for millennia to come. The tragedy of Magnus's breach extended beyond its immediate consequences to encompass the complete derailment of the Emperor's long-term plans for humanity's evolution. The Webway project had represented far more than an improved transportation network. It was intended to serve as the foundation for humanity's transformation into a fully psychic species capable of defending itself against any threat the galaxy could produce. The controlled environment within the Webway passages would have provided ideal conditions for developing psychic abilities without risking chaos corruption, while the network's expansion would have eliminated humanity's dependence on warp travel and its associated dangers. The destruction of this vision represented a catastrophe that dwarfed even the military losses inflicted by the Horus Heresy. The Emperor had invested centuries of effort and enormous psychic resources in creating the infrastructure necessary for humanity's evolutionary leap, only to see it transformed into a highway for the very entities he had sought to protect the species from. The irony was particularly bitter given that Magnus had possessed the psychic potential to serve as a key figure in humanity's transformation, his abilities making him ideally suited to help guide the species through its transition to full psychic awareness. The Emperor's relationship with Magnus had been among his closest and most hopeful, as the Crimson King's intellectual curiosity and psychic gifts had seemed to embody humanity's future potential. The Thousand Sons Primarch's fall from grace represented not just a personal betrayal, but the loss of a crucial ally in the Emperor's grand design for human evolution. Magnus's corruption by chaos entities seeking to exploit his guilt and desperation over the Webway breach eliminated any possibility of redemption or reconciliation, transforming one of the Emperor's most beloved sons into an active enemy of everything he had worked to achieve. The demon war within the Webway continued to escalate as more chaos entities became aware of the breach and sought to exploit it for their own purposes. The four great chaos gods began to coordinate their efforts, sending their most powerful demon princes and greater demons to assault the dimensional barriers that the Emperor struggled to maintain. These entities possessed capabilities that far exceeded those of the lesser demons that had initially poured through Magnus's breach, requiring correspondingly greater expenditures of psychic energy to banish or contain. The Emperor found himself fighting opponents whose power approached his own, creatures that could match his psychic abilities while possessing the advantage of existing primarily within the warp rather than being anchored to a physical form. The Custodian Guard, those genetically enhanced warriors who served as the Emperor's personal protectors, were deployed in increasing numbers to provide physical security for the sections of the webway that remained accessible from Terra. These golden-armored giants fought running battles against demon incursions that manifested within the passages, their guardian spears and bolter weapons proving effective against entities that had partially manifested in real space. However, the custodians could not address the fundamental problem of the dimensional breach itself, which required psychic intervention that only the Emperor possessed the capability to provide. The Sisters of Silence, those rare individuals whose psychic null abilities could disrupt warp-based phenomena, were also committed to the Webway War in unprecedented numbers. Their presence created zones of psychic nullification that prevented demons from fully manifesting within the passages, buying time for the Emperor to focus his efforts on banishing the most dangerous threats. However, the Sisters' abilities were limited in scope and duration, requiring them to work in carefully coordinated rotations to maintain effective coverage of the most critical passage junctions. The industrial capacity of Terra was gradually redirected towards supporting the Webway War, with forge complexes producing specialized weapons and equipment designed for fighting demonic entities in interdimensional environments. Psychically attuned ammunition, blessed oils and unguents, and protective wards were manufactured in vast quantities to supply the forces fighting within the passages. The planet's entire economy began to revolve around sustaining a conflict that remained largely invisible to the general population, who were told only that critical infrastructure required increased security measures. The Emperor's isolation from imperial governance created a power vacuum that various factions attempted to fill, though none possessed the authority or capability to truly replace his leadership. The Council of Terra, composed of high-ranking imperial officials and military commanders, assumed responsibility for day-to-day administration, while the Primarchs handled military operations in their respective sectors. However, the lack of unified command and the absence of the Emperor's strategic vision created coordination problems that the traitor forces were quick to exploit. The Mechanicum of Mars found itself divided by the heresy, with some Forge worlds declaring for Horus, while others remained loyal to the Emperor. The schism within the Tech Priests' ranks created supply shortages for loyalist forces, while providing the traitors with access to advanced weapons and equipment that had previously been restricted to Imperial use. The loss of Mars's industrial capacity represented a strategic disaster that further hampered the loyalist response to the growing rebellion. As the Horus Heresy spread across the galaxy, the Emperor's battle within the Webway intensified correspondingly. The emotional turmoil and psychic energy generated by the massive conflicts raging throughout Imperial space provided additional power for chaos entities seeking to exploit the breach in Terra's defenses. The demon incursions became more frequent and more powerful, requiring ever greater expenditures of the Emperor's psychic strength to contain. His consciousness, already stretched to its limits by the demands of maintaining the Webway's dimensional stability, was forced to adapt to an escalating threat that showed no signs of diminishing. The realization that his greatest creation had become his greatest burden weighed heavily upon the Emperor's consciousness as he fought his endless war within the interdimensional passages. The Webway that was meant to herald humanity's golden age had instead become the anchor that prevented him from defending the Imperium against its greatest existential threat. The bitter irony of the situation was not lost on a being whose temporal perception allowed him to see how different choices might have led to vastly different outcomes, though such knowledge provided no comfort in the face of the catastrophe that Magnus's breach had unleashed upon the galaxy. The siege of Terra had raged for 55 days, when the emperor made the decision that would determine the fate of humanity for the next 10 millennia. From the ramparts of the imperial palace, he could observe the devastation that Horus's forces had wrought upon the cradle of mankind. The once magnificent spires of Terra's greatest cities lay in ruins, their adamantine structures reduced to twisted metal and pulverized rockcrete by the relentless bombardment of traitor artillery. The sky above the throne world burned with the fires of orbital combat, as loyalist and traitor fleets engaged in desperate battles that rained debris upon the planet's surface like falling stars. The Emperor's physical form remained anchored to the Golden Throne, his consciousness still locked in the endless battle against the demon incursion within the webway. Yet his awareness extended far beyond the interdimensional passages, where he fought his desperate holding action against chaos entities. Through his enhanced perception, he could observe every aspect of the siege unfolding around the imperial palace, from the individual struggles of guardsmen manning the outer walls to the grand strategic movements of entire armies across Terra's scarred continents. Rogel Dorn's defensive preparations had transformed the imperial palace into the most formidable fortress in human history, its walls reinforced with layers of adamantine plating and void shields that could withstand direct hits from battleship-grade weaponry. The palace's defensive systems incorporated technologies recovered from the dark age of technology, alongside innovations developed specifically for this siege, creating overlapping fields of fire that could destroy entire armored companies within minutes. Yet despite these preparations, the Emperor could see that the palace's defenses were gradually being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the traitor assault. The forces arrayed against Terra represented the largest military concentration in galactic history. 4 entire Space Marine legions had declared for Horus, their ranks swollen by cultist auxiliaries, demon engines, and the corrupted remnants of Imperial army regiments that had fallen to chaos during the long years of civil war. The Sons of Horus led the assault with their characteristic aggression and tactical flexibility, while the World Eaters threw themselves against the palace walls in frenzied charges that left the battlements slick with blood. The Death Guard advanced methodically through the outer defensive rings, their enhanced resilience allowing them to shrug off casualties that would have broken lesser forces, while the Emperor's children sought weak points in the defenses with the precision that had once made them exemplars of Imperial military doctrine. The Emperor's psychic senses detected the presence of his corrupted sons among the attacking forces, their once pure psychic signatures now tainted by the malevolent energies of their chaos patrons. Mortarian's essence reeked of pestilence and decay, reflecting his transformation into a demon prince of Nurgle. Fulgrim radiated the twisted perfection of Slaanesh, his pursuit of sensation having led him down paths that had stripped away his humanity entirely. Angron's psychic presence burned with the mindless rage of Khorne, the butcher's nails that had tormented him for decades now augmented by demonic possession that had transformed him into a creature of pure violence. Most painful of all was the psychic signature of Horus himself, the Warmaster whose corruption represented the Emperor's greatest failure as both father and leader. The golden radiance that had once marked Horus as the most favored of the Primarchs had been replaced by a writhing darkness that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. The Emperor could perceive the chaos entities that had taken residence within his son's enhanced physiology, their malevolent presence twisting his thoughts and emotions toward ever greater acts of destruction and betrayal. The being that commanded the traitor forces bore little resemblance to the loyal son who had once stood at the Emperor's side during the Great Crusade's greatest victories. The siege's progression followed patterns that the Emperor's temporal perception had foreseen decades earlier, though the specific details varied according to the countless variables that influenced individual battles. The outer defensive rings fell one by one as traitor forces concentrated overwhelming firepower against specific sections of the palace's perimeter. Each breakthrough cost the attackers enormous casualties, but Horus's forces possessed numerical superiority that allowed them to absorb losses that would have crippled smaller armies. The loyalist defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that Terra's fall would mean the end of the Imperium and humanity's descent into an age of darkness from which it might never recover. the Emperor's loyal sons fought with distinction during the siege's most critical phases. Rogel Dorn coordinated the palace's defenses with methodical precision, his strategic brilliance evident in every carefully planned fallback position and overlapping field of fire. Sanguinius led counterattacks that temporarily drove back traitor advances, his presence on the battlefield inspiring loyalist forces to feats of heroism that defied rational explanation. Jagatai Khan's white scars struck at traitor supply lines and communication networks, their hit-and-run tactics disrupting enemy coordination at crucial moments. Yet despite their efforts, the Emperor could see that the siege's outcome was inevitable unless he took direct action. The traitor forces possessed too many advantages in terms of numbers, equipment, and demonic support for the loyalist defenders to maintain their resistance indefinitely. The palace's walls, no matter how well fortified, could not withstand the concentrated assault of 4 Space Marine legions supported by the unlimited resources of chaos. The Emperor's temporal perception revealed potential futures where the palace fell within days, its defenders overwhelmed by enemies who had once been their brothers in arms. The decision to abandon his post at the Golden Throne represented perhaps the most difficult choice the Emperor had made in his millennia of existence. The demon incursion within the webway required his constant attention to prevent it from spreading beyond the interdimensional passages into Terra's physical structure. Every moment he spent away from the psychic barriers that contained the chaos entities increased the risk of catastrophic breach that could transform the throne world itself into a demon world. Yet the alternative was to remain passive while Horus destroyed everything he had worked to build, allowing the Imperium to collapse while he fought an ultimately futile holding action against enemies that could simply wait for his physical form to succumb to exhaustion. The Emperor's preparation for departure from the Golden Throne required careful coordination with the Adeptus Custodes and Sisters of Silence who had been fighting the demon incursion within the webway. Additional psychic barriers were constructed around the most critical breach points, while the palace's defensive systems were reconfigured to provide overlapping fields of psychic nullification that would slow any demon expansion during his absence. The measures were temporary at best, buying hours rather than days before the contained entities would break through their restraints, but they would have to suffice for the confrontation that lay ahead. The Emperor's physical departure from the Golden Throne sent ripples of psychic energy throughout Terra and beyond, as being sensitive to warp phenomena detected the movement of a psychic presence that had remained stationary for decades. On distant worlds, astropaths collapsed as the psychic beacon that had guided their communications suddenly shifted position, while navigator houses throughout the galaxy reported disruptions in their ability to perceive the astronomican's guiding light. The Emperor's movement represented a fundamental shift in the galaxy's psychic landscape, one that would have far-reaching consequences regardless of the confrontation's outcome. The teleportation assault on the vengeful spirit was planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the Emperor's greatest military victories during the Unification Wars and Great Crusade. The strike force assembled for the mission represented the finest warriors that loyalist forces could provide: the Emperor himself, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, and Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists, supported by elite formations of Adeptus Custodes and Imperial Fists Terminators. Each warrior had been selected not only for their combat capabilities, but for their psychological resilience against the chaos corruption that would undoubtedly permeate Horus's flagship. The vengeful spirit itself had undergone horrific transformations during the years of civil war, its once pristine corridors twisted into labyrinthine passages that defied rational architecture. The ship's machine spirit had been corrupted by prolonged exposure to chaos energies, its systems responding to the malevolent will of entities that existed partially within the warp. Bulkheads pulsed with organic growth that resembled living tissue, while the vessel's atmospheric systems circulated air tainted with the psychic residue of countless atrocities committed in the name of the dark gods. The ship had become less a vehicle than a living extension of chaos itself, its very structure designed to corrupt and destroy anyone who entered its halls. The teleportation process itself was fraught with dangers that extended beyond the normal risks of matter transmission through warp space. The Vengeful Spirit's location within the Imperium was heavily defended by psychic barriers and demon entities that sought to intercept any attempt at boarding. The Emperor's psychic abilities were essential for navigating these defenses, his consciousness guiding the strike force through dimensional barriers that would have been impassable for ordinary humans. The teleportation success required precise timing and enormous expenditures of psychic energy, leaving the Emperor partially drained before the confrontation with Horus had even begun. The strike force materialized within the Vengeful Spirit's command sections, their arrival detected immediately by the ship's corrupted sensory systems. Alarms began wailing throughout the vessel as traitor forces mobilized to repel the boarding action, but the Emperor's temporal perception had anticipated their responses. The Loyalist warriors moved through the ship's twisted corridors with purposeful efficiency, their route planned to avoid the heaviest concentrations of enemy forces while progressing steadily toward the bridge where Horus awaited his father's arrival. The battles fought within the Vengeful Spirit's corridors defied conventional military logic, as the ship's chaos-corrupted structure actively assisted the defending traitor forces. Passages would suddenly reconfigure themselves to trap advancing loyalists, while bulkheads would sprout weapon emplacements that fired without human operators. The very air within the ship seemed to resist the loyalist advance, growing thick and oppressive as they approached areas of greatest chaos corruption. Demon entities materialized without warning to assault the strike force, their attacks coordinated with those of the traitor Space Marines who defended their flagship with fanatical determination. Sanguinius proved instrumental in the strike force's advance through the ship's nightmarish interior, his psychic abilities allowing him to detect ambushes before they could be sprung, while his combat prowess carved through enemy resistance with devastating efficiency. The Blood Angel's Primarch's presence seemed to inspire his companions to greater efforts, his nobility and courage providing a psychological anchor against the corrupting influences that sought to undermine their resolve. Yet even Sanguinius showed signs of strain as they penetrated deeper into the ship, his perfect features marked by the effort required to resist the chaos energies that permeated every surface. Rogal Dorn's tactical expertise proved equally valuable in navigating the Vengeful Spirit's defenses, his analytical mind identifying patterns in the seemingly random configuration of the ship's corrupted architecture. The Imperial Fist's Primarch directed the strike force's movement with characteristic precision, his understanding of fortification principles allowing him to recognize weak points in defenses that had been designed according to inhuman logic. His presence provided stability and purpose to the mission, his unwavering loyalty to the Emperor serving as an example to the other members of the strike force. The Adeptus Custodes fought with the silent efficiency that had made them the Emperor's chosen guardians for millennia, their guardian spears and bolter weapons proving devastatingly effective against both traitor Space Marines and demon entities. These golden-armored giants moved through the ship's corridors like instruments of divine wrath, their enhanced physiology and superior equipment allowing them to engage multiple enemies simultaneously without apparent effort. Yet even they showed signs of the strain imposed by prolonged exposure to chaos corruption, their movements becoming slightly less coordinated as the malevolent energies within the ship worked to undermine their enhanced capabilities. The Imperial Fist's Terminators provided heavy fire support for the strike force's advance, their storm bolters and power fists clearing obstacles that would have required extensive preparation to overcome through conventional means. These veterans had fought in countless boarding actions during the Great Crusade, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the nightmarish environment within the Vengeful Spirit. The ship's corrupted structure seemed to actively resist their presence, with bulkheads that required multiple power fist strikes to breach and atmospheric systems that circulated air thick with psychic corruption. The approach to the ship's bridge required the strike force to navigate through sections that had been completely transformed by chaos corruption, their original purpose as starship compartments barely recognizable beneath layers of organic growth and demonic influence. The Emperor's psychic senses detected the presence of powerful chaos entities throughout these areas, creatures that had been bound into the ship's structure to serve as both guardians and weapons against any who would dare to challenge Horus's authority. These entities could not be destroyed through conventional weapons, requiring psychic intervention that further drained the Emperor's already taxed abilities. The final approach to the bridge was defended by the elite of Horus's forces, including Terminators from the Sons of Horus Legion, whose armor bore the marks of demonic possession and chaos corruption. These warriors fought with the skill and experience that had made them among the galaxy's finest soldiers, but their techniques had been enhanced by demonic gifts that made them far more dangerous than their loyalist counterparts. The battle for access to the bridge required the strike force to engage enemies who possessed not only superior numbers but supernatural abilities that defied conventional tactical responses. The Emperor's arrival at the Vengeful Spirits Bridge marked the beginning of the confrontation that would determine the Imperium's fate for millennia to come. The vast command chamber had been transformed into a throne room worthy of a demon prince, its walls decorated with trophies taken from worlds that had fallen to chaos during the long years of civil war. The air within the chamber was thick with psychic energy that made breathing difficult for ordinary humans, while the deck plates beneath their feet pulsed with organic growth that suggested the ship itself had become a living extension of its master's corrupted will. Horus awaited his father's arrival, seated upon a throne constructed from the wreckage of loyalist starships, his once magnificent armor now bearing the marks of demonic corruption that had transformed him from the Emperor's most beloved son into his greatest enemy. The War Master's physical form had grown larger and more imposing during his transformation, his enhanced musculature straining against armor that had been redesigned to accommodate his new proportions. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, which no longer held the warmth and intelligence that had made him the Emperor's chosen successor, but instead burned with the cold malevolence of the chaos entities that had taken residence within his enhanced physiology. The confrontation between father and son aboard the Vengeful Spirit would echo through 10 millennia of human history, its consequences reshaping not only the Imperium, but the fundamental nature of humanity's relationship with the divine. The Emperor faced Horus across the corrupted bridge of the flagship, seeing in his once beloved sons features the complete triumph of chaos corruption over paternal bonds and imperial loyalty. The War Master's transformation had progressed beyond mere physical enhancement to encompass a fundamental alteration of his essential nature, his humanity stripped away by the demonic entities that now wore his enhanced form like a suit of living armor. The battle that followed defied conventional description, as two beings of godlike power unleashed forces that warped reality itself within the confines of the starship's command chamber. The Emperor's psychic abilities, honed across millennia of existence and enhanced by his desperate fury at his son's betrayal, manifested as waves of golden energy that shattered bulkheads and melted deck plating with their intensity. Horus responded with power drawn directly from the chaos gods themselves, his attacks channeling the combined malevolence of entities that had spent eons planning humanity's destruction. The duel's progression revealed the true extent of Horus's corruption and the Emperor's reluctance to destroy what remained of his son. Each exchange of psychic energy and physical blows demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary Primarchs, as both combatants drew upon reserves of power that transcended normal biological limitations. The Emperor's strikes were precise and devastating, targeting the demonic entities that had taken residence within Horus's enhanced physiology, while attempting to preserve whatever fragments of his son's original personality might remain uncorrupted. Horus fought without such restraint, his attacks designed to inflict maximum damage, regardless of the consequences to his own physical form or the structural integrity of his flagship. The chaos entities that controlled his actions cared nothing for his survival beyond its utility in destroying the Emperor, viewing the War Master's enhanced body as merely another weapon to be expended in service of their cosmic goals. This fundamental difference in motivation created tactical advantages for Horus, as he could commit to attacks that the Emperor was forced to defend against rather than counter with equal destructiveness. The turning point came when Horus's assault breached the Emperor's psychic defenses and inflicted wounds that penetrated to his essential being rather than merely damaging his physical form. The Warmaster's claws, enhanced by demonic power and wielded with supernatural strength, tore through the Emperor's armor and flesh to strike at the psychic matrix that maintained his consciousness across multiple dimensions. The injuries were unlike anything the Emperor had experienced in his millennia of existence, attacking not just his body, but the fundamental structures that enabled his immortal existence. The Emperor's realization that his son was truly lost came in the moment when Horus prepared to deliver the killing blow, his corrupted features showing no trace of recognition or regret for the patricide he was about to commit. The being that had once been the Emperor's most beloved son now existed only as a vessel for chaos entities whose hatred for humanity burned with the intensity of stellar fire. The Emperor understood that any mercy shown to this creature would result not only in his own destruction, but in the complete triumph of chaos over the species he had spent his existence protecting. The psychic energy that the Emperor unleashed in response to this realization exceeded anything he had previously manifested, drawing upon reserves of power that he had carefully hoarded throughout his long existence. The attack was not merely destructive, but annihilating, designed to completely erase Horus's existence from both the material universe and the warp itself. The golden fire that erupted from the Emperor's consciousness burned away not only Horus's physical form, but the demonic entities that had corrupted him, their screams of agony echoing across dimensions as they were torn from existence by forces they could not comprehend or resist. The effort required to completely destroy his son and the chaos entities within him proved to be the Emperor's undoing, the massive expenditure of psychic energy leaving his physical form critically damaged and his consciousness scattered across multiple dimensional planes. The wounds inflicted by Horus's claws had already compromised his ability to maintain coherent existence in the material universe, and the final attack that destroyed the Warmaster consumed the last reserves of strength that might have enabled his recovery. The Emperor collapsed upon the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, his golden armor cracked and bloodied, his breathing reduced to shallow gasps that barely sustained his failing organs. The loyalist forces that recovered the Emperor's broken form from the Vengeful Spirit faced a crisis that threatened to destroy the Imperium even in the moment of its greatest victory. The Master of Mankind, whose presence had served as the foundation for human unity and expansion across the galaxy, lay dying from injuries that defied all attempts at conventional healing. His consciousness flickered between the material universe and the warp, his psychic presence becoming increasingly unstable as his physical anchor to reality weakened with each passing moment. The decision to entomb the Emperor upon the Golden Throne was made in desperation rather than hope, as Imperial technicians and Medicae struggled to find any means of preserving their master's life. The ancient device that had served as his psychic amplifier during the Webway project offered the only possibility of maintaining his consciousness in a stable state, its life support systems potentially capable of sustaining his damaged body indefinitely. The process of connecting the Emperor's failing form to the throne's mechanisms required techniques that pushed the boundaries of Imperial medical knowledge, as his injuries existed on both physical and psychic levels that conventional treatment could not address. The transformation that occurred when the Emperor was fully integrated with the Golden Throne exceeded all expectations and fears of those who witnessed it. His physical body, while sustained by the device's life support systems, became little more than a desiccated husk that bore only passing resemblance to the vital figure who had once led the Great Crusade. Yet his psychic presence exploded outward from Terra with unprecedented intensity, his consciousness expanding to encompass not merely the solar system, but significant portions of the galaxy itself. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon which had guided Imperial vessels through the warp, was transformed from a useful navigation aid into a blazing lighthouse that could be perceived from the galaxy's edge. The Emperor's new existence defied conventional understanding of life and death, consciousness and corporeality. His physical form remained anchored to the Golden Throne, sustained by increasingly complex life support systems that required constant maintenance and the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose life force was channeled into maintaining his corporeal shell. Yet his psychic essence existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, fighting constant battles against chaos entities while maintaining the barriers that protected humanity from demonic incursion. The being that had once walked among his subjects as their immortal but recognizably human leader had become something far more abstract and terrible, a psychic entity of godlike proportions whose consciousness spanned star systems. The irony of the Emperor's transformation was not lost on those who understood the imperial truth's fundamental principles. The being who had spent millennia fighting against religious belief and supernatural worship had become, through the circumstances of his near death and entombment, the focus of exactly the kind of veneration he had sought to eliminate from human consciousness. His obvious divine nature, manifested through psychic abilities that exceeded those of any other known entity, made it impossible for imperial citizens to view him as merely an enhanced human being. The secular empire he had envisioned was transformed within decades of his entombment into a theocratic state where his worship became the central organizing principle of human civilization. The growth of the imperial cult represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the emperor had claimed to believe, yet it also served practical purposes that his rational philosophy had failed to address. The faith that billions of humans placed in their god-emperor generated psychic energy that strengthened his consciousness and enhanced his ability to protect them from chaos corruption. The prayers offered in his name created a network of psychic resonance that extended his influence far beyond what his individual consciousness could maintain, while the devotion of his worshippers provided emotional sustenance that helped preserve his sanity during the endless battles he fought within the warp. The establishment of the ecclesiarchy as the Imperium's official religious institution marked the complete abandonment of the imperial truth in favor of a theology that elevated the emperor to divine status. The priests and cardinals who administered this new faith created elaborate doctrines that explained the emperor's current state as a necessary sacrifice for humanity's salvation, his suffering upon the golden throne serving as eternal proof of his love for the species he had created and guided. These teachings bore little resemblance to the secular philosophy that had once defined imperial ideology, but they provided meaning and hope for populations struggling to survive in a galaxy that had become far more dangerous following the Horus Heresy's conclusion. The Emperor's consciousness, spread across multiple dimensions and constantly engaged in psychic warfare against chaos entities, experienced existence in ways that defied human comprehension. His awareness encompassed countless simultaneous battles fought within the warp, each one requiring precise application of psychic force to prevent demon incursions into the material universe. The mental strain of coordinating these efforts while maintaining the astronomician and protecting Terra from supernatural assault created a form of existence that bore little resemblance to conventional life, his consciousness fragmented across so many different tasks that coherent thought became increasingly difficult to maintain. The daily sacrifice of psychers required to sustain the Emperor's physical form represented one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets and greatest moral compromises. The Golden Throne's life support systems consumed enormous amounts of psychic energy, requiring a constant supply of human souls to fuel the mechanisms that kept the Emperor's body functional. These sacrifices were drawn from the populations of psychers that the Imperium gathered from across the galaxy, individuals whose psychic abilities made them both valuable resources and dangerous liabilities. The black ships that collected these unfortunates delivered them to Terra in their thousands, where they were processed through rituals that drained their life force to sustain their master's continued existence. The Emperor's perception of this sacrifice varied according to which aspects of his fragmented consciousness were engaged with the process at any given moment. Some portions of his awareness recoiled from the necessity of consuming human souls to maintain his existence, recognizing the practice as a fundamental violation of the principles he had once espoused. Other fragments of his consciousness accepted the sacrifice as a necessary evil, understanding that his continued existence was essential for humanity's survival against threats that would otherwise overwhelm the species entirely. The moral complexity of the situation reflected the broader contradictions that had emerged from his transformation from secular leader to divine entity. The Emperor's role as humanity's psychic protector extended far beyond the maintenance of the Astronomicon to encompass active intervention in conflicts across the galaxy. His consciousness could manifest in locations where Imperial forces faced overwhelming odds, his psychic presence providing strength and guidance to commanders who found themselves confronting enemies beyond their capabilities. These interventions were typically subtle, taking the form of enhanced intuition or sudden tactical insights rather than obvious supernatural assistance, but their cumulative effect was to preserve Imperial forces that would otherwise have been destroyed by superior opponents. The question of the Emperor's ultimate fate remained a source of intense debate among those few individuals who possessed sufficient knowledge and authority to speculate about such matters. Some Imperial scholars believed that his consciousness was slowly dissipating across the vast distances it was required to encompass, his individual identity gradually dissolving into the collective psychic field that protected humanity from chaos corruption. This interpretation suggested that the Emperor was dying by degrees, his sacrifice becoming more complete with each passing century, until nothing would remain but an impersonal force that maintained the barriers between real space and the warp. Alternative theories proposed that the Emperor's consciousness was actually growing stronger through its constant exposure to psychic energy and its absorption of the life force provided by daily sacrifices. According to this view, his transformation represented not a slow death, but a gradual apotheosis that would eventually result in his emergence as a true god, capable of challenging the chaos entities on equal terms. Proponents of this theory pointed to the increasing frequency of miraculous events associated with Imperial forces and the growing strength of the Astronomicon as evidence that the Emperor's power was expanding rather than diminishing. A third possibility, whispered among the most secretive circles of Imperial leadership, suggested that the Emperor was deliberately maintaining his current state as part of a long-term strategy that extended across millennia. This theory proposed that his apparent suffering and gradual decline were carefully orchestrated deceptions designed to lull his enemies into complacency while he accumulated the power necessary for his eventual resurrection. According to this interpretation, the Emperor retained his capacity for long-term planning and strategic thinking, his consciousness working toward goals that would not become apparent for thousands of years. The Emperor's influence on Imperial governance operated through channels that were often invisible to those who made decisions in his name. The High Lords of Terra, who administered the Imperium in his absence, claimed to act according to his will, but their understanding of his intentions was filtered through layers of religious interpretation and political necessity that often distorted his original purposes beyond recognition. The bureaucratic machinery that had grown up around his worship created its own imperatives and priorities, many of which conflicted with the rational governance principles he had once advocated. The Space Marine chapters that claimed descent from his genetic legacy represented perhaps the most direct continuation of the Emperor's original vision, though even they had been transformed by the religious fervor that now defined Imperial culture. These superhuman warriors maintained their dedication to protecting humanity from its enemies, but their motivations had shifted from secular duty to religious devotion. The Emperor they served was no longer the rational leader who had created them, but a divine figure whose will was interpreted through the teachings of the Imperial cult and the traditions of their individual chapters. The Emperor's consciousness occasionally achieved sufficient coherence to observe the state of the Imperium that bore his name, and these moments of clarity often filled him with profound ambivalence about what his empire had become. The theocratic state that worshipped him as a god represented everything he had fought against during his millennia of guiding human development, yet it also served as humanity's primary defense against the chaos corruption that would otherwise have consumed the species entirely. The imperial cult's emphasis on faith and devotion created psychological barriers against demonic influence that his rational philosophy had failed to provide, while the ecclesiarchy's organizational structure maintained social cohesion across thousands of worlds that might otherwise have descended into anarchy. The technological regression that had occurred throughout the Imperium during the millennia following the Horus Heresy represented another source of frustration for the Emperor's consciousness when it focused on such matters. The advanced scientific knowledge that had characterized human civilization during the Great Crusade had been largely replaced by superstition and ritual, with the Adeptus Mechanicus serving as the sole repository of technical expertise in a galaxy where machines were worshipped rather than understood. This development contradicted his vision of humanity's rational advancement, yet it also provided stability in a universe where uncontrolled technological development could lead to chaos, corruption, or artificial intelligence rebellion. The Emperor's eternal vigil continued across the millennia, his consciousness maintaining its desperate battle against the forces of chaos, while simultaneously serving as the psychic foundation for human civilization's continued existence. The golden throne that sustained his physical form had become both his prison and his weapon, its ancient mechanisms enabling him to project his influence across the galaxy, while trapping him in a state of living death that defied conventional understanding. His sacrifice had preserved humanity from extinction at the cost of his own freedom, transforming him from an active leader into a passive guardian whose protection operated through suffering rather than strength. The ultimate question of whether the Emperor would ever return to active leadership of the Imperium remained unanswered as the 41st millennium drew toward its close. Some believed that his resurrection was inevitable, that the accumulation of faith and psychic energy would eventually restore him to his former glory and enable him to lead humanity to final victory over its enemies. Others maintained that his current state was permanent, that his transformation into a divine entity had fundamentally altered his nature in ways that precluded any return to mortal existence. Still others whispered that his death was approaching, that the mechanisms sustaining his consciousness were gradually failing and would eventually leave humanity defenseless against the darkness that surrounded them. Regardless of his ultimate fate, the Emperor's legacy had become inextricably woven into the fabric of human civilization across the galaxy. His transformation from dying man to psychic beacon had created the foundation upon which the Imperium's continued existence depended, while his deification had provided the spiritual framework that enabled billions of humans to find meaning and purpose in lives that would otherwise have been consumed by despair. The God Emperor of mankind, whether viewed as divine protector or tragic sacrifice, had become the eternal guardian of a species that could no longer imagine existence without his constant vigilance against the forces that sought their destruction. The Emperor's vigil would continue for as long as humanity endured, his consciousness serving as the barrier between civilization and chaos, his suffering the price of his species' survival in a galaxy that offered no mercy to the weak or unprepared. In death, he had achieved the immortality that had always been his nature, though at a cost that transformed victory into eternal burden and salvation into perpetual sacrifice. The master of mankind had become something greater and more terrible than he had ever intended, his love for humanity, expressed through an existence of constant pain that would endure until the last human drew breath in a universe that had forgotten the meaning of peace.